Early in the morning, warm rays of light penetrate into a cozy apartment, illuminating everything in it. A telephone alarm clock wakes up the main character named Frank from a heavy sleep. Barely opening his sleepy eyes, Frank notices something very strange and frightening. On the ceiling of his room are painted bright red hieroglyphs with unknown meaning. However, quite quickly the hieroglyphs begin to disappear, and Frank wonders if he is delusional. However, the hieroglyphs were more real than ever, but Frank did not have time to understand their meaning. Suddenly, Frank notices one very strange and frightening detail that has eluded him until now. Having looked around carefully, Frank realizes that he is not in his room. Frank continues to wander his eyes around the room, trying to figure out where he is, but nothing gives him a clue. Frank cannot find a single detail from his previous room, but suddenly visions begin to haunt his head. From the visions, it follows that he found himself in a parallel world, in which he was the same orphan, but lived a different life. His age and face have not changed, but in this world he received care, passed exams, and entered a top university, but after that he decided to work as an ordinary salesman. However, the main cause of concern for Frank remains the mysterious hieroglyphs that were inscribed on the wall. Frank saw nothing in the memories of his new self that would clarify this event. Suddenly, Frank's thoughts are interrupted by a gentle female voice, affectionately calling him by his nickname Zaya. The source of the voice turns out to be a terribly beautiful young girl dressed in a short shirt. Frank can't believe his eyes, asking himself when he got married in a parallel universe. Frank's wife sits next to him on the bed, inviting him to go eat. Frank goes through the options of addressing the woman he loves in his thoughts, trying to choose one of them. Deciding to call her by her first name, Frank decides to test his new self's memory to find some information about his wife. However, after going through all possible memories in his memory, he cannot find absolutely nothing about his wife. Turning in her direction, he notices that she is looking at him with an empty, chilling gaze and asks her who she is. Suddenly, the beautiful girl's body begins to distort, transforming into something disgusting. But during these terrible metamorphoses, she asks a strange question in an eerie voice about whether he can see her. Frank tells her that his brain seems to be overloaded and that's why he's imagining things. Frank's wife turns into a terrible monster, growling the phrase that he can see her. Frank is paralyzed with shock and horror and silently looks at the monster, which after a short pause jerks his head off. A split second later, Frank wakes up in bed again, screaming in fear. Wiping cold sweat from his forehead, Frank tries to understand what kind of dream it was and whether he is alive now. However, looking up, he again discovers those same hieroglyphs on the wall. Frank, convinced that he died and somehow returned there, suggests that there is a clue hidden in these hieroglyphs. Also, after his death, Frank discovered several new memories from his past life, from which it follows that in his past he never saw any wife and always lived alone. Frank realizes that there is some meaning in his wife's phrase that he sees her, and he must at all costs not let her find out that he sees her. However, during Frank's thoughts, the door to his room begins to slowly open again under the influence of thin, pale fingers. The wife comes into the room again, repeating word for word her greeting and the offer to go eat, but Frank decides to pretend that he doesn't see her. Frank sits down on the bed and begins to look down intensely, but his wife crawls up to him, trying to look into his eyes. Suddenly, the girl's neck turns 180 degrees, and she looks at Frank with the same creepy look, saying that now it's her turn. Frank is frightened by giving himself away, and his wife asks him in an otherworldly voice why he decided to play against the rules. After this, the wife repeats the already familiar phrase that he sees her, and chuckles, wrapping her long tongue around Frank's face. In a split second, Frank's head is violently torn from his body, and the entire room is splattered with blood. Frank wakes up in his bed again, wishing his wife dead out of anger. Frank holds his head, trying to come to his senses, trying to answer his questions about whether he is in a time loop, and why, after death, he starts over again. Frank understands that his wife needs to make sure he can see her, so he takes out his phone so he can look at it and not be distracted by her. Half a minute later, the wife reappears in the room with the usual greeting, but this time she is interested in why Frank is looking at other girls. The girl sits close to Frank, sarcastically saying that he somehow holds the phone too close. However, fortunately for Frank, this does not give her evidence that he can see her. Frank tries to concentrate, mentally saying that clinging to a man like that is a forbidden technique. Having gathered his strength, the main character continues to switch the video on his phone. However, after a few switches, he comes across a video of his bed, on which his wife is lying, and asks Frank if he can see everything clearly. Frank is frightened by this unexpected turn and recoils, throwing the phone on the bed. Behind him, his wife reappears, now convinced that Frank can see her. Frank decides not to give up, and after cursing at her, turns around to deal her a powerful blow with his fist. However, the transformed wife deftly dodges the blow, weightlessly jumping to the side. At the same second, she sinks her razor-sharp teeth into Frank's hand, biting it clean off. Lying on the floor and bleeding, Frank promises himself to try to escape next time, slowly dying. Frank continued his attempts, but his wife managed to surprise him every time and prove to himself that he saw her. On the 8th time, he tried to escape through the window, but they were blocked. After 10 attempts, Frank decided to try to enjoy it and not hide from his wife. However, the outcome was always the same, and his wife always turned out to be a monster who mercilessly ate him. Frank lost track of time after his 13th death, remembering only new details about this world that emerged to him during each new rebirth. The essence of this world was beyond Frank's understanding, and he still had questions. Frank did not understand what kind of creature his wife was, and also did not know whether there were other entities like her in this world. However, 18 deaths later, he vowed that she must die so that he could save himself. During all this time, full of agony and torment, Frank realized that despite the fact that she always wakes him up, she never touched him. Frank correctly guesses that his wife is dangerous only if she understands that he sees her in other ways, and calmly passes through her into the kitchen. Frank makes himself breakfast, ignoring his wife's complaints that he doesn't have to make it twice. Frank notes that in addition to her dazzling beauty, his wife is terribly cunning. Frank is snacking on a sandwich when his wife's face appears on the table and asks him why he doesn't eat what she made. However, this time Frank successfully ignores all the amazing antics of his wife and overcomes the obstacles on the way to leaving the apartment. Slamming the door behind him, Frank mentally tells himself that no one can get away with 18 murders. Frank moves away from his apartment, saying that he must take revenge for what happened to him. The main character goes down the landing and opens the entrance door. However, upon going outside, he is blinded by a blood-orange light and Frank cannot believe what he sees. An otherworldly world appears before Frank, full of strange and creepy creatures floating in the air. Frank bursts out laughing, unable to comprehend the terrible reality in which he finds himself. However, quite quickly the short-term madness is replaced by severe nausea, and Frank begins to vomit right on the asphalt. Suddenly, a little girl approaches him, asking him if he is sick and how he is feeling. Frank looks painfully tired at the child and puts his hand on her head, gently stroking her, saying that everything is fine with him. The child's face suddenly transforms into some kind of scary face, and she repeats the already memorized phrase that he sees her. Before Frank's eyes, the girl turns into a huge monster, which raises a huge bone knife over him. Frank starts laughing madly again, saying that he really liked her at first. While the monster begins to strike, Frank understands that there are incredibly many such monsters in this world, so he doesn't have to worry about the possibility of dying. A huge cleaver reaches the hero, turning him into bloody mince smeared on the asphalt. Frank opens his eyes again, lying in his bed, and his wife again comes to wake him, lying down next to him on the bed. Once again out on the street, Frank decides to observe this world and make several discoveries about how everything works in it. From Frank's observations, it follows that ordinary monsters cannot influence the outside world, even if they really want to. However, some of them take on a human form and try to provoke a response from the victim in order to then kill him. Frank tries to understand why they need this, and makes the assumption that they want to become one with the world of people. Frank takes the bike and checks his balance after making small purchases, noticing that he only has 3 yuan left in his account. Frank believes he will have to get a job to explore this world. Frank examines his phone, checking his correspondence for clues to his past life, and learns that he quit his job but had to come in to settle a case. Having found everything he needs, Frank decides to hit the road to his work, hoping to find additional clues there. Arriving at the place, Frank discovers a building that is not at all what he expected to see. According to Frank, there should have been a sales office here, but he arrived at the Sanshan Psychiatric Hospital. Frank decides to investigate the situation, but in the process he receives a phone call from which an unfamiliar voice begins to swear at him. Having settled matters with abstract excuses and saying that he is not comfortable talking right now, Frank hangs up and continues his research. Frank remembers that there used to be B.I. Luo Academy here, and now a psychiatric hospital has appeared on this site from somewhere. Frank decides to move on, noting that despite the creepiness of this place, he is incredibly interested in what is happening. Suddenly, Frank is lightly pushed by something invisible, causing him to stumble back a little. Frank notices that something soft touched him and tries to feel it in the air. Suddenly, a woman's breast materializes in front of him, which he unknowingly touched. A second later, Frank's cheek is burned by a strong slap in the face, which he receives from the owner of this same woman's breast. Suddenly, a young girl appears in front of him and promises to sue him, calling him a pervert. Frank looks up and sees B. Luo Academy in front of him, instead of a mental hospital. However, with concentration, Frank begins to see the other world again, but now there are some changes in it. Frank can now see both the academy and the mental hospital as if they were superimposed on each other. Frank touches the walls of the academy, and his hand passes through them freely, as if through air. Frank is scared of what might happen and worries about whether real people can see what he does. However, deciding that the interest in what is happening outweighs the possible costs, he pulls himself together and walks through the ghostly wall. Frank finds himself in dark corridors, stained with blood and emitting eerie sounds from their dark corners. Frank examines the assembly hall, the dining room, and the toilet without finding a soul. But after a short search, he comes across a room in which there is a heavy smell of blood. Having passed through the wall, Frank sees the silhouette of a girl lying with her back to him and crying bitterly. However, after a second, the girl gets up and turns around, calling for her brother, revealing her withered and empty face. However, Frank just walks by unfazed, going through the next wall. Behind the next wall, a huge monster, similar to a mutated abscess, awaits Frank and licks his lips, looking at him with 4 eyes. Frank, however, manages to pass by without any problems, still ignoring the presence of the creepy creature. Frank continues to explore the hospital, encountering all sorts of creatures and each time avoiding death by ignoring them. Mentally, Frank, in an ironic manner, thanks his wife for killing him 18 times, teaching him the necessary techniques. Frank notices the sick leaves, trying to pick them up in order to find any clues. Realizing that these sheets are ephemeral and he cannot lift anything, Frank decides to get up when he suddenly notices some kind of dark matter seeping through his face. Quickly realizing what's going on, Frank calmly stands up, ignoring the monster hanging from the ceiling, which looks like a distorted and disfigured nurse. The nurse comes downstairs, offering to join him in exploring the secrets of the hospital, but Frank still ignores her and leaves, deciding to find the answer in the dean's office. Frank walks into the main part of the building, noticing how the hospital's offices blend into the sales office, noting that the dean's office is most likely located above. Walking through the corridors, Frank notices 2 shadows, which indicate that the general manager named Melvin is furious that Frank has not yet shown up. Meeting up with Melvin and his friend Marty, Frank ignores the former's hysteria and walks past them. Frank goes to the 3rd floor, unable to find the dean's office on the 2nd, and Melvin and Marty try to follow him up and stop him. After some time of searching, Frank finally finds the right door and opens it. Entering the office, he discovers a guy and a girl named Wes and Selena, who were having a very good time. Frank takes Selena's hand as Wes and Marty tell him to get out of here and let the girl go. However, Frank doesn't want anything from Selena and simply pushes her aside, trying to find something valuable in the office. After running his eyes over the table, Frank finds a mysterious note. Frank reads the text, noting that this hospital keeps big secrets. After studying the note, Frank learns that the key to knowledge is stored in Office 520 of Block C, mentally wondering who this letter is addressed to. Frank goes looking for his office, trying to figure out how the dean could have known that Frank would have to, while Marty tags along, asking him how he's feeling. However, quite quickly, the dim light bulbs on the floors burn out instantly, and along with them, the light turns off in the entire building. Selena panics a little when she finds herself in pitch darkness, and Wes tells Melvin to find out where the power brush is. Not wanting to wander around in the dark, Frank turns on the flashlight on his phone, slightly illuminating the path in front of his eyes. Frank goes out into the main hall again, using his flashlight to scan the large hall, but sees almost nothing. Selena, Marty, Melvin, and Wes also go down to Frank, walking into the light of a flashlight, trying to somehow communicate with the technical staff. Wes states that based on his abilities and position, he has access to more than others can imagine. He adds that the absence of a mobile phone signal, voltage, and electricity can only indicate one thing. According to Wes, their entire group somehow ended up in a forbidden area. One of the employees is lamenting that he has lost all his unsaved work progress, which will take a very long time to restore. A guard named Flynn asks the others if they are okay, to which they answer in the affirmative, after which he announces that he is going to go check the plugs in the shields. The rest of the workers take out their phones to also light their way in the dark. The crowd begins to get a little nervous, irritated, and panicked by the lack of communication and news about the return of electricity. Frank asks Wes what this zone he's talking about is all about. The crowd begins to panic more after hearing the words about the restricted area, whispering anxiously and lashing out at each other. Wes decides to stop the rising panic and shouts to everyone to shut up. He continues to speak, saying in a serious tone that he will now say vital things that everyone needs to learn. Wes explains that the supernatural exists in this world, and the so-called forbidden zone is the realm of these forces, which can be understood as subspace. The crowd notices that Flynn's guard has been gone for 3 minutes, to which Wes timidly suggests that he has encountered otherworldly beings. Melvin approaches Wes and asks him what they should do, to which he replies that they need to figure out a way to get out alive. Suddenly, Frank notices a dim light hovering near the ceiling and emitting a dark aura. A familiar chill creeps through Frank, and he realizes that otherworldly forces are already here. Frank tells the people that they are already here, but she excitedly tries to clarify what exactly he means. The employees begin to panic again, nervously telling Frank that he is lying, but he suddenly notices the disappearance of an employee named Stella. He asks the others where she went, but no one can answer him, because everyone saw her literally just next to them. Stella's friend tries to feel for her friend in the dark, but all she can grasp is heavy air. Wes turns to Frank, asking him if he has seen what otherworldly creatures look like, to which he replies that he only noticed Stella's disappearance. The employees are frightened by the fact that Frank remains surprisingly calm, despite the eerie situation. Wes notes that Frank is not at all afraid of otherworldly creatures and asks him if he is an Esper. Frank asks again in confusion, to which Wes explains that an Esper is a person with paranormal abilities, and the best way to defeat these creatures is to use these abilities to the maximum. Wes's words inspire Frank, and he becomes interested in how to practice these abilities. Wes mentally marvels that Frank can think so clearly even in such a situation and believes that he could be the key to saving them. Wes explains to Frank that there are 2 conditions needed to practice abilities. The first condition is baptism with the fear of death, which encourages the soul to suffer and allows supernatural forces to penetrate you. However, according to Wes, there are also certain conventions, one of which states that this power is like a rag, which by absorbing part of what is wiped with it, thus desecrating the soul of the wearer. Frank thinks about the prospects and weighs all the possibilities that may appear before him. Frank understands that both his wife and all the monsters on the streets are just an illusion that he cannot touch just like that. But if they burst into reality, they will be able to immediately kill people. However, this also means that if he can touch them and receive their power, then he will be able to destroy them all, and especially will have the long-awaited opportunity to take revenge on his beloved wife for everything she did to him. While thinking, Frank does not notice how another employee named Tad is abducted by otherworldly creatures. Wes yells at the crowd again, ordering them to calm down so as not to invite more of them here. Selena begins to cry, telling Wes that she is very afraid and does not want to disappear. Frank interrupts the couple's discussions with the phrase that this happens once every 2-3 minutes. He clarifies that after a man disappears, the timer until the next one is 3 minutes, and after a woman disappears, 2 minutes. Frank says that based on this data, there are no more than 3 minutes left until the next disappearance. Frank begins to walk into the darkness, and Marty asks him where he was going, to which he replies that he went to look for a way out. Frank replies that there are only 9 of them left, which means in about 20 minutes everyone will be dead if they stay here. Wes shouts after Frank about how an ordinary person can know something about this, but he is interrupted mid-sentence. Frank looks at Wes, mentally telling him to shut up, and says that if he says one more word about this, he will kill him himself. Sometime later, Frank and Marty are combing the dark corridors, trying to find a way out. Suddenly, at the end of the corridor, a dim greenish light begins to shine, the same as in the hospital. Before Frank's eyes, the floor under his feet begins to transform, and Marty frightenedly clings to him, asking him to wait. A few seconds pass, and they find themselves in the corridors of the Sanshan Psychiatric Hospital. Marty asks Frank why they suddenly ended up in a mental hospital from some horror movie, causing Frank's surprise. Frank studies the walls and realizes that the subspace of the hospital and its reality have become one, and therefore its inhabitants too. Frank opens the room and sees blood-spattered walls and clothes that belong to the disappeared people. Frank guesses what happened and tells Marty that office workers have a slim figure and a body mass index within the normal range. To Marty's nervous question, Frank sums it up by saying that the monster ate women in 2 minutes and men in 3. Frank says that most of the monsters are locked in the chambers, but if a door was opened somewhere, they were able to escape, but during all this time they did not encounter anyone. Frank examines the clothes, noticing that they are quite clean, and there is blood only at the cut sites, which means they used something sharp. Frank assumes that the most likely case will be one of the medical staff, and in his head he remembers the sound of a scalpel cutting the air. Frank puts all his guesses together, suggesting that this could be the creepy nurse he encountered earlier. Suddenly, from the darkness of the corridors, some noise and whispers begin to be heard again, and the space around them begins to change again. A group of survivors emerge from the darkness, no longer sure whether they are in the premises of their building. Melvin notices Frank and Marty and asks them how they ended up here and if they found any traces of the missing persons. Selena notices a pool of blood and becomes very frightened, screaming loudly in horror. Wes notices the bloody clothes, wondering out loud that the owners must have been eaten. Selena clings to Wes, telling him that she is very scared and wants to go home. Wes tells Frank that they will follow him, but he stares intently at his phone. Frank looks up from the timer, telling everyone that the time has come. Wes and Selena do not understand him, asking him again about what the time has come for. Suddenly, the nurse's black hair, like oil, which Frank already knew, begins to hang behind them. Wes and Selena turn around and notice a nurse quickly crawling along the ceiling. Without thinking twice, the nurse jumps from the ceiling to the floor next to Selena and Wes. While running away, Wes pushes Selena and she asks him for help, holding his jacket pleadingly. However, Wes throws Selena, forcing him to let go, and runs away ahead of the rest of the group. Selena asks Wes not to leave her, but the nurse is already hovering over her. Selena reaches out to Frank and Marty, calling for help, but the main characters do nothing, watching as the nurse holds a scalpel to Selena's throat. Having fallen on Selena, the nurse decides not to torture the poor girl and gives her a quick death, killing her with one blow. However, as soon as Selena stops showing signs of life, the nurse indulges in her angry impulses and inflicts dozens of blows on her lifeless body with a scalpel. Frank notices that the nurse does not show any interest in them, but continues to deal with the body. The nurse, meanwhile, having played enough with a scalpel, begins to devour Selena's body. Frank realizes that cannibalism is an instinct and not a way to kill her victims, and decides to stick around and study the nurse better. Frank approaches the nurse, observing how her body behaves during the meal. Frank swings his fist and punches the captivated nurse in the back of the head with all his might. From the blow, Frank's fist breaks into blood, and the nurse acts as if she didn't notice anything. Frank realizes that all monsters have such power that a person cannot resist them, so the only way to finish off these creatures is to become an esper. Frank continues to stand by the nurse, telling Marty that she has a strange way of killing, but while she is eating the victim, she is safest. Marty tells Frank that she is already finishing her food, to which he replies that Selena has large breasts, so she will eat them longer than others. Frank remembers the words that to gain strength you need to let supernatural energy into your soul. Frank looks for an open spot on the nurse's body and notices that part of her thigh is exposed. Frank lightly slaps the nurse on the thigh, trying to determine what the effect will be. Marty tells Frank that he could not imagine this, even after the most perverted adult films, recommending that he move away. Frank tells Marty that he wants to stay a little longer, and if he wants, he can leave now. Marty thinks for a while, then says everything to hell and agrees to stay. Marty carefully approaches the nurse, who is engrossed in her meal, and sits down next to Frank. Marty also places his hand on the nurse's thigh, gently touching her skin. Marty feels a piercing cold coming from the nurse and asks Frank if he feels anything, to which he receives a negative answer. Marty notes that he would never have believed that it was the first time he touched a woman's thigh, saying that it was soft. Frank tells Marty that they have a minute and a half left, so they need to run. Frank goes into the timer app and sets it for exactly 1.5 minutes. After that, he takes off, shouting to Marty that it's time to run away from here. Marty asks Frank if he's sure this is the best idea or if he's been here before. However, after a split second, the nurse catches up with our heroes, quickly moving behind them along the ceiling. Frank tries to figure out why she changed her strategy and quickly figures out that Selena had breast implants. However, at the same moment, the nurse delivers a precise blow, completely cutting off Frank's head. Having woken up, Frank expresses the hope that there will be no silicone in heaven and finds himself next to a nurse finishing Selena. Frank is surprised that the day is not reset from the very beginning, but given the mistakes of the past, he decides not to hesitate. He remembers Selena's implants, realizing that they have very little time left. He stands up and grabs Marty's head, saying that they don't have time for this, claiming that she will be finishing her meal soon. Frank pulls Marty down the flights of stairs, telling him to hurry up. Our heroes catch up with Wes, who panics and says that otherworldly creatures are about to overtake them. Frank jumps down a flight of stairs, outrunning all the other escapees. Marty asks the others why they are running so slowly, to which they answer him that they have already descended 20 floors. Marty argues with the crowd, saying that they only went down 3 and have already caught up with them. Wes looks around and begins to panic, saying that they are definitely in the walls. He explains his words by saying that otherworldly beings can create illusions. According to him, one day one person who fell into this trap was doomed to be imprisoned in it for the rest of his days. Frank listens carefully to Wes's words and begins to look for solutions, rummaging in his pockets. He invites everyone to throw away some of their belongings to leave a mark. Employees dig into their pockets and throw household items down the stairs. Frank, Wes, and Marty rush forward down the flights of stairs when suddenly Frank stops. Marty approaches Frank, asking him what happened, and notices the things the group left behind earlier. Employees begin to panic, recognizing their belongings, not understanding what to do next. Frank approaches one of the abandoned items and begins to examine it, while Wes warns everyone that it is an illusion. He clarifies his guess, saying that espers can see all these illusions, unlike ordinary people. Wes begins to pray, saying that he wants to manifest the esper's powers before he dies in order to gain respect from his family. The employees try to imitate Wes while Frank decides to move on to more useful things. Frank recalls that the old hospital plan did not have an elevator, but there was a staircase that could be retained in the current layout. Wes notices Frank leaving and follows him down the flight of stairs, asking where he is going, to which he replies that he would rather look for a way out than pray, wasting precious time. Wes thinks that Frank has been acting calmly, like a boa constrictor from the very beginning. He begins to wonder how Frank and Marty spent so much time with the nurse and still came back alive, but he doesn't come up with any reasonable answer. Frank, meanwhile, approaches the walls trying to find some clues. Scrolling through the layout of the building in his head, he counts down the floors, looking for a saving door. Suddenly, Frank's hand hits cold metal and he freezes in place. Concentrating, Frank reveals a heavy metal door in the wall. Wes immediately runs up to Frank, pushing him aside, rejoicing at the discovery. However, no one except Frank can notice the doorknob, so he approaches it again and slowly turns it to the side. The doorknob clicks and the heavy metal door opens heavily. A corridor opens before the survivors, in which a mysterious unknown and darkness reigns, blacker than death. Wes pushes Frank aside and joyfully runs into the darkness, shouting that he is saved. The frightened employees follow him, not paying attention to the standing Frank. One of the employees pokes his head into Frank and Marty's back and asks why they are standing still, to which Frank mentally notes that he does not want to be the last when the nurse goes hunting again. Wes suddenly stops the other survivors and they stop in their tracks and freeze. Before their eyes, already gradually accustomed to the darkness, a fork appears without any signs. The employees talk to each other, inviting each other to go and check one of the options, but no one decides to go into the darkness. Frank smoothly joins the crowd and begins to look around while others whisper to each other, looking at him. The crowd begins to ask Frank which path he will take. adding that if he found this door, he will find a way out. Some of the employees can't stand it and start shouting, telling Frank not to put on airs and tell him where to go. However, Frank indifferently replies that he doesn't care about them and isn't particularly worried about the nurse. Frank mentally adds that to him they are just meat. He slowly walks into the right corridor, mentally reasoning that at the moment the nurse is invincible. From his reasoning, it follows that in order to get out, someone will definitely have to sacrifice themselves. After some time, the sound of limbs quickly moving across the ceiling begins to clearly reach the survivors, forcing them to immediately run away. Frank notes to himself that the nurse is already here, and she emerges from the darkness, quickly pursuing Melvin. The nurse gets closer and closer to the survivors, choosing the slowest of them all as a target. The last one to escape is Melvin, so he decides to resort to the most pathetic of actions. Having gained strength, he grabs his colleague by the collar and throws him to the floor behind him, leaving him to be torn to pieces by the nurse. The unfortunate guy only has time to shout Melvin's name, and at the same instant the nurse cuts off his head with a well-timed blow. Frank notices this act, noting how quickly humanity has fallen in such a situation, mentally wondering if there is a difference between Melvin and the nurse after his act. The nurse begins to cut up and devour the body of the murdered man again, so Frank calmly approaches her. Marty looks for Frank among the fleeing people and turns around, again surprised by what he sees. Frank sits next to the nurse again, slowly touching and squeezing her thigh and calves, trying to figure out how to gain otherworldly powers. Marty sits down next to Frank again, asking him for permission to touch the monster's thighs. After silent agreement, Marty begins to greedily paw at the nurse's feet, saying that her skin feels like crystal. Frank mentally chuckles at what a strange day it is, after which they walk away, and he already asks Marty out loud if he is afraid that the nurse might have killed him then. Marty replies that although the chances of death are great, together with Frank he will most likely survive. Meanwhile, all the survivors arrive at the mess hall, and Wes says that the mess halls always have an emergency exit. Melvin approaches Wes, asking where the exit is, to which he replies that he will find it soon, but one of his colleagues beats him to it, running up to the wooden door. Wes stops his colleague, saying that he will go to investigate first, in fact rejoicing that he will be the first to escape, leaving the others behind. Another corridor appears before Wes, who opened the door, and the rest of the survivors. As they move through it, Frank notes that the oppressive atmosphere begins to fall on their shoulders more and more. Having gone to the end and opened the treasured door, everyone discovers that they are in a dead end from which there is no way out. Frank understands that he should have chosen the left corridor at the fork and estimates how many more people must die in order to get there in time. He understands that there is no time to return and a considerable part will not be able to escape. Moving away from the others, he is annoyed that he cannot roll back to the nurse on his own. The crowd begins to blame Frank for leading them into a dead end, causing a dark smile to appear on his face. Marty shames the crowd by telling the survivors that they themselves asked Frank to make a choice, and now they blame him for all the troubles. Melvin says they trusted Frank's choice but didn't expect it to be wrong. He adds that Frank not only violated their trust, but also led to certain death. Wes distracts everyone from the quarrel by saying that the monster only attacks one person at a time, so they have a few minutes between attacks. According to him, it is necessary to choose a victim and try to escape, after which Wes pushes Frank, saying that he should be this victim. Marty yells at Wes, asking him what the hell he's doing and demanding that he let him go. One of the employees offers Melvin to help Frank, but he stops her. Marty captures Wes, preventing him from restraining Frank by yelling at him. Wes curses Marty and calls Melvin for help, who immediately runs to the rescue. Melvin leans on Marty, forcefully dragging him away from Wes and throwing him to the ground. Marty calls Wes scum while Melvin pins him to the ground, preventing him from freeing himself. Their fight and quarrel is interrupted by the loud knock of a metal door at the end of the corridor. The crowd tries to figure out who closed it, but Frank is on the other side of the door. Wes, Melvin, Marty, and one of the employees look at him, dumbfounded, while the employee, closing her eyes, convinces herself not to look at what is about to happen. Frank says that he always thought that he could not show feelings for people, but he did not suspect that these monsters would be so interesting. Frank thanks the survivors for piqued his interest in the creatures, promising that next time things will be different. He says that he will thank them for everything, and at that very moment the nurse blows his head off with a blow of a scalpel. The survivors kick down the door and run out of the hallway as the nurse begins to fuss with Frank. Marty cries and runs to Frank's corpse, saying that he will never leave him. Wes runs away and decides to look back, after which he freezes in place in horror. Marty holds the severed head of Frank, who, with his last breath, smiles and tells everyone to wait for his return. Frank travels back in time to the moment he first touched the nurse's thighs. He takes Marty by the shoulder and says that he needs to run because there is no time left, answering the silent question with a phrase about implants. Frank quickly breaks into a run, thinking through his plan of action, and catches up with the employees running up the stairs. In the usual manner, Frank jumps several flights of stairs and ends up in front of the rest of the group. Frank immediately begins to go further down, not paying attention to the surprised survivors, while Marty again asks them the question of why they are running so slowly. While the crowd is again saying the same thing as before, Frank continues to go down, counting down the floors. Having found the right place, he reveals the metal door again, immediately opening it. Wes and Marty are surprised at how quickly Frank found a way out of this situation and follow him. The group comes to a fork in the road again, and Wes tells Frank that he will follow him. He adds that he will give Frank $5 million if he gets him out of here. Frank looks at the timer, realizing there is 1 minute left, and tells Wes that he still has some work to do here. Wes asks Frank what his business is, but Frank interrupts him with a kick to the groin. Wes writhes in pain and falls to his knees as Frank mockingly laughs at him. Wes wheezes at Frank, telling him that he will answer for this, writhing in unbearable pain. Melvin asks Frank why he did this, to which Frank replies that the monster is so fast that it would take him less than a minute to kill them, so he did them a favor by sacrificing Wes. Melvin, Marty, and another employee mull over the idea, and everyone except Melvin agrees with him. However, Frank did not plan to ignore Melvin's past actions and also hits him in the groin. Melvin's face contorts into a grimace of excruciating pain and he also falls to the ground. Frank looks at Melvin, grimly informing him that he must die. The employee asks Frank why he popped Melvin and Wes's balloons because that's enough for that. Frank decides not to go into detail and says he did it just in case. Marty is encouraged by Frank's behavior, saying that he is the coolest. Some employees begin to whisper, wondering what they should do if he pulls some nonsense again. Meanwhile, Frank moves on and says that if they go right, they will die, and if they choose the left corridor, they will live. The employees ask Frank why he doesn't take the left path first. Frank replies that everyone else has 10 seconds to escape while he needs the nurse's thigh. The employees are surprised by this answer, but Marty, on the contrary, rejoices at this news and comes closer to him and expresses a desire to stay. After some time, the nurse reappears from the darkness, looking for a new victim. The last stragglers run away from her further down the corridor, hiding her in pitch darkness. Rushing after them, the nurse comes across Wes and Melvin lying on the ground and Frank standing next to them. Wes says out loud the phrase that it has become somehow wet here, feeling some kind of liquid on him and looking at his hand, covered with someone else's blood. Realizing the desperation of his situation, Wes tries to grab Frank's leg, cursing him. However, Frank prevents Wes from grabbing him and steps on his hand, forcing him to the ground. Frank sits down on his knee without removing his foot from Wes's hand, telling him that he is not going anywhere and will stay here. Frank adds that he will gladly watch Wes die, looking indifferently as the nurse bears down on him. Wes only manages to utter a faint cry before the nurse snaps his neck with a deft movement. Frank watches as the nurse rips Wes's head off with her bare hands and is splashed with a fountain of blood. Frank savors the taste of death, straightening his hair and enjoying the way the nurse cuts up Wes's body. Frank's heart begins to ache, and he remembers his wife, hoping that one day she will die in his arms. Frank sits down next to the nurse again, placing his hands on her hips as he continues to try to feel her strength. The employees look dumbfounded at Frank's behavior, telling each other that they don't believe that he really sat down to paw the monster. Frank looks at Marty, remembering how he desperately wanted to choose with him and did not abandon him in any situation. Frank gets to his feet and motions for Marty to join, but to others he appears in a rather creepy guise. The employees run away, calling him a scary monster, and Marty remains standing in place, frozen in fear. Frank snaps out of his ominous trance and sobers up his mind, noticing that apparently after 20 deaths, his mind is starting to become cloudy. According to his reasoning, He completely stopped feeling empathy for people. Frank looks at Marty, realizing that he is unlikely to regain his humanity, but for Marty it is not over yet. Marty says that he is a loser from an ordinary family, and of all the others, only Frank became his friend. He moves closer to Frank and confidently states that he trusts him and will stay with him. Marty also adds that Frank looks like he has become some kind of animal, to which Frank responds only with sad silence. Stepping over Wes's severed head, Marty sits next to Frank and touches his thigh again. The heroes continue to study the monster's hip, when suddenly Marty asks Frank why he attacked Wes. Frank tells him that this creature runs much faster than people, so when they had to sacrifice someone in order to gain time, most likely everyone would choose Frank and Marty because they don't care about them. Suddenly, Frank feels a tiny spark of strange energy moving from the nurse to him. Frank jerks his hand away, asking Marty to stop for a moment. The main character asks Marty if he felt this cold piercing his whole body. Marty answers in the negative, but Frank again feels the same way, saying that it wasn't his imagination. Frank feels the nurse's energy penetrating into him in an ever-increasing flow. He concentrates, closing his eyes and feeling his energy waves synchronize with the nurse's aura. Frank mentally suspects that all this is an omen of the awakening of the Force. Frank turns to Marty and notices that he is too carried away by the woman's leg, completely forgetting who it belongs to. Marty invites Frank to leave, but he objects, saying that he sensed a point of concentration of energy. Meanwhile, Melvin tries to escape by slowly crawling away from the nurse who is devouring Wes's body. Marty tells Frank that he also feels the concentration point, but cannot materialize it. The nurse turns her attention to Melvin, beginning to rip his limbs off. Having finished him off, she again begins to prepare for the meal, licking Melvin's lifeless head. Frank says that since Melvin is very fat, they still have a little time before they have to get out of here. Frank again focuses on the nurse's energy and allows the otherworldly forces to slowly penetrate him. Frank feels the nurse's power enveloping her, passing through her entire body. Power fills his heart, entering his soul, and Frank realizes that the soul itself is amorphous, but he can give it shape. Concentrating all his spiritual forces, he forms in his mind the image of a sharp sword, which after a second dissolves in the air. A second later, something pierces Frank's consciousness, rushing deep into the depths of his subconscious. Before Frank's eyes, there appears a neat red ball in which energy is imprisoned, and he makes the assumption that this is his soul, tainted by otherworldly forces. Frank's entire body resonates with his heart, filling it with incredible strength. Frank realizes that his senses of touch, smell, and hearing have increased exponentially. The main character feels much smarter and stronger than usual, surprised at how quickly this happened. The true essence of this world appears to Frank, and he plunges into thought. He notes that he feels like his power has only awakened 1%. According to the main character, in the future he will have to merge with these monsters more than once in order to gain all their power. Frank remembers that an Esper's power is a manifestation of the soul, so his desires will manifest in it. Frank wonders what his soul wants, and his heart is pierced by discharges of burning pain. Frank feels that as soon as he strikes, severe pain shoots through him. Frank recalls that while dying, he did not feel physical pain, but experienced exceptional mental torment. Frank bursts out into mad laughter, imagining how wonderful it would be to make these monsters feel the same. However, his thoughts immediately turn to the main object of his hatred, his precious wife. Frank is immersed in sweet fantasies of revenge and is completely unable to hear anything around him. However, at some point his hearing returns and he hears Marty shouting at him. The main character's friend says that 2 minutes have passed and they need to get out. Frank tells him that he will stay behind to try out his new abilities, to which Marty just nods approvingly and stays with him. Frank silently and slowly approaches the nurse, who is engrossed in eating Melvin. Clenching his fist tighter, he concentrates all the pain in it after 21 deaths. As Frank approaches the monster, he thinks that if he continues to die more and more, he will only become stronger. Frank concludes that his abilities are limitless, thanks to endless resurrections. Getting close enough and concentrating all his strength, Frank delivers a powerful blow, shouting to the monster that it will be the first to experience all his pain. The fist successfully reaches the nurse's forehead, mercilessly cutting into her skin. From the force of the blow, the nurse flies back several meters, losing her precious scalpel. Frank decides to get closer, testing the effect of the blow, remembering that he only used 1% of his strength. However, the nurse, as if nothing had happened, returns to eating Melvin, showing no interest in Frank. Frank examines her and finds no signs of his blow, suggesting that she put all her energy into defense. Marty invites Frank to run, but he does not hear him, immersed in thoughts about what could harm this creature. Frank notices her scalpel nearby, which exudes an ominous aura. The main character smiles, deciding to make another attempt to kill the nurse. Frank bends down and picks up a scalpel, to which shadow tentacles immediately flock. As soon as Frank lifts him off the ground, dark energy from the scalpel penetrates his body, filling his mind with flashes of someone else's life. Frank sees all the nightmares that this nurse created, performing terrible experiments on people. The main character understands that in the end she could not stand this nightmare and turned into a monster. Based on Frank's guess, the true power of the nurse lies precisely in this scalpel. Having absorbed his power and coped with the emerging images, Frank wonders whether he can deal with her using her own scalpel. Frank approaches Marty, who is again stuck to the otherworldly creature's thigh, and asks him to step aside. Quickly approaching the monster, Frank delivers an accurate and precise blow with a razor-sharp scalpel. The scalpel whizzes through the air and hits the nurse's unprotected neck. Frank is perplexed that the blow had no effect and takes a closer look. Marty approaches the nurse and pulls down her collar, saying that her point cuts people, but did not leave a scratch on her neck. Frank is trying to understand why a scalpel that can cut anyone had no effect. Without thinking twice, Frank comes to the conclusion that it's all about the spirit of the host. In his opinion, the scalpel should be fueled by the spiritual strength of the owner, but now his strength is depleted. Frank concludes with annoyance that he won't be able to take revenge right now. Frank takes off running, grabbing Marty by the collar, shouting to him that there is no time left and it's time to run away. The nurse finishes her meal and looks around restlessly, looking for her scalpel. Frank and Marty, breaking away from the nurse, find themselves in a room with high ceilings, looking around. Frank, using his heightened senses, senses an alien presence in the room. The outsiders turn out to be the surviving employees, and Frank mentally notes that they were well hidden. Marty looks around and notices 4 doors, asking Frank which one they need. The surviving employees come into the light and are happy that Frank and Marty are okay, asking for their help. Marty scolds the survivors, saying that they are only capable of running, but are always waiting for instructions from Frank. Frank considers all possible options and concludes that the solution in this situation is quite simple. According to Frank, everyone should go through one of the doors. One of the employees says that time is running out, and spending it checking every door would not be the best solution. Frank, however, decides not to engage in pointless discussions and invites them to do whatever they want, leaving through one of the doors. A few seconds later, the familiar sounds of a nurse approaching are heard from the corridor, and the staff are amazed at how quickly she dealt with 2 people. Frank mentally guesses that the reason for this strange behavior is the theft of her scalpel. After thinking a little, Frank chooses one of the doors and opens it, inviting the others to run after him. Behind the door there is a familiar staircase, and Frank runs up. Everyone else tries to keep up with Frank, hearing the nurse in the next room. A split second later, the nurse knocks down the heavy door with a strong blow, sending it flying and climbing into the room. Ignoring those lagging behind, the nurse, like the wind, overtakes everyone and rushes forward. Marty shouts to Frank, warning him of danger to the right. Frank turns his head, but a nurse is waiting for him on the wall, screaming about her scalpel. Frank is no match for the nurse's speed and agility, and she easily jumps on him, knocking him off his feet. In a quick motion, the nurse presses herself against Frank and rips his throat out with her razor-sharp teeth. Dying, Frank looks at the creepy face of the nurse, realizing that this turns out to be the wrong choice. Returning to the past, Frank decides to leave Wes and Melvin to be devoured by the nurse. He also decides to steal her scalpel again, taking advantage of the nurse's penchant for cannibalism. Frank and Marty decide not to wait for the nurse to eat and run away. Having reached the northern exit, Frank decides to run into the elevator, moving away from the nurse. However, the nurse starts chasing him again and manages to notice him in the elevator. She manages to stick her hand through the elevator doors, preventing them from closing, and easily deals with Frank again. On his next attempt, Frank decides to try the southern exit, also stealing the nurse's scalpel. However, he suffers another setback as the nurse quickly catches up with him. Frank concludes that his only option is the eastern exit, hoping it won't be a dead end. Frank realizes that the nurse beats him in speed, but he can use his rebirths to predict her actions. He notes that he will have to memorize not only her movements, but also the terrain. Having looked around properly, Frank finds an emergency exit and remembers the path to it. However, as soon as he moves away from the emergency exit, the nurse entangles his neck with her hair. Having died by her hand for the 9th time, Frank draws up a plan of action, hoping that this time everything will work out. Having been reborn, Frank unmistakably shows the way to his companions. This time the nurse pursues Frank exclusively, not paying attention to others. The monster rushes at Frank, but its sharp claws only cut the air next to him. The nurse looks at Frank in surprise, but he just grins, looking into her face. The nurse frowns, preparing for the next attack, and Marty looks at what happened, having a hard time believing that Frank was able to dodge such an attack. Frank turns around and starts to run away, further angering the nurse, who screams and launches another attack. However, Frank manages to dodge every attack from the nurse due to the fact that he anticipates all her movements. The nurse goes into a frenzy and jumps from the ceiling to the floor so that she can easily strike Frank. Frank is proud that this time he is able to predict her movements and continues to scurry away. Having dodged another attack, Frank looks up and sees that the nurse is already flying on top of him. However, thanks to his improved physical attributes, he once again dodges the attack using a roll. By the time the nurse lands on the ground, Frank is already on his feet. The nurse screams at Frank to let himself be killed and goes into a rage again. Meanwhile, Frank finally finds a door from which a safe aura emanates, and realizes that this is the exit. Frank rushes to the exit, and the nurse, completely ignoring the stunned survivors, tries to catch up with him. Marty looks at what is happening and understands with warmth in his heart that Frank is a real Esper. Frank runs to the door, thinking that he has finally found a real way out. Turning around, he sees that the nurse is not following him, but is only watching him, not daring to approach the area covered with a soft green light. Like a cat, the nurse moves her hand back and forth, asking Frank not to leave. Realizing that the prey is lost, the nurse rushes at Marty in a rage. However, after crashing into Marty, the nurse instantly disappears, causing him to fall to the ground. The protagonist's friend adjusts his glasses and looks around in amazement, not understanding where the nurse should go. The employees ask the same questions and look for Frank. Marty finds him first and asks him about where the monster went and how he is feeling. Frank replies that the most logical option would be for the nurse to run out the door. However, according to Frank, she immediately jumped out of the way when she came into the area of the door's light. Frank suggests that perhaps behind the door there is a way out of this place, but this could also mean that there are creatures worse than a nurse hiding behind it. Peering through the window, Frank notes that he sees nothing but complete darkness. The darkness, according to Frank, is very reminiscent of an abyss in which it is very easy to disappear. The survivors are happy that they have found a way out and ask Frank why he doesn't open the door. Frank turns to the survivors, looking at the situation meaningfully, and says that they will go there after a short rest. Marty says that these 10 minutes of escaping death left him terribly tired. The other survivors follow Frank's example and sit down briefly to regain their strength. Bracing himself, Frank opens his eyes and rises to his feet, telling the others to follow him. Having opened the door, a group of survivors walks in pitch darkness, trying to find the walls by touch. Everyone, without exception, feels some kind of ominous aura and feels the invisible presence of some entity. Frank looks at everyone around him, mentally preparing himself for the fact that he will never see any of them again. At the end of a dark corridor, a group of survivors stumbles upon another door, behind which small lights can be seen. Frank senses something wrong, suspecting that there is some danger lurking behind this door. Marty asks Frank if this path is safe, to which he replies that they have no choice. Frank is the first to step out the door and finds himself in a strange place, feeling very unusual. Contrary to the expectations of the protagonist, despite the feeling of an ominous presence, nothing has happened to him yet. Frank tries to shout something but cannot even hear the sound of his voice. Frank notes that the entire path is shrouded in continuous darkness, so he can only go forward. The main character is already losing track of time when suddenly a small hole appears in front of him in the pitch darkness. Frank approaches the exit and ends up right at the academy gates. Not believing what is happening, Frank looks around, trying to figure out if he really got out. However, the illusion soon dissipates, and he finds himself among a group of survivors who find themselves in the park. All employees look around and joyfully ask each other if they managed to get out of this nightmare. Marty asks Frank if they can reach them here, to which he responds in the negative, saying that they are all still at the hospital. Suddenly, a disturbing thought strikes Frank, and he looks around nervously again. Frank realizes that he does not see the psychiatric hospital, like all otherworldly inhabitants. Marty approaches Frank, telling him that he is very tired and wants to go home. He adds that no matter what, they will have to return to work tomorrow. Frank asks Marty about his intentions, and he repeats to him that they are all expected at work tomorrow. A shocking thought once again pierces Frank's anxious mind. Frank realizes that he has lost the ability to see all otherworldly inhabitants. The main character runs away in a panic, attracting the attention of Marty, who asks him where he is going. Frank continues to nervously look around the city and realize that everything has disappeared. Frank thinks that he can accept that the hospital evaporated and he got away with it. One much more important problem for Frank is the inability to take revenge on otherworldly creatures, and especially his beloved wife. From Frank's point of view, only he should kill his precious wife. Sometime later, Frank hails a taxi and drives home, sitting restlessly in the back seat. He mutters about how they couldn't just disappear, adding that what worries him the most is his wife's disappearance. The driver informs Frank that they have arrived, announcing the bill for the trip. However, Frank ignores the driver's words and runs out of the car, ignoring his screams. Frank runs to his home, rushing up flights of stairs, saying that anyone in this world can disappear. Finally reaching the door to his apartment, Frank completes his thought that only his wife cannot disappear. Frank calls out to his lover as he opens the door, only to find an empty apartment. Not finding his wife at home, Frank falls exhausted to the floor, crushed by his emotions. Frank says out loud that his wife can kill him as many times as she wants, but she won't be able to return him to normal life. He gets up tiredly, looking lost at his feet, and begins to wander around his apartment. He recalls that his wife and nurse humiliated him more than a dozen times, and only hatred of them supported him all this time. Frank vows that he will find a way to take revenge and make them feel all the suffering he experienced. However, their disappearance leaves an irreparable mark on Frank's soul, since now he will not be able to fill the emptiness within himself. Frank lifelessly opens his eyes, not understanding what he now needs to live for. He turns on his side and receives an incoming call, in which he is told that the academy burned down yesterday. Frank immediately gets out of bed, turning on the latest news program on his phone. The program says that yesterday at 7 o'clock in the evening there was an uncontrolled fire at the academy and lists the dead, among whom is Frank's name. Frank bursts into manic laughter, saying that his mind is racing with the thought that he too is dead. From Frank's point of view, this means that all is not lost, which means he knows that this is just another ploy. Very quickly, his thoughts switch to his beloved wife, and he again finds himself in a cheerful mood. Frank looks at the ceiling and promises that he will meet his wife again soon. Frank's thoughts are interrupted by a swarm of messages from Melvin, each of which contains the same text asking him to come to work immediately. Frank looks at the flood of these messages and starts laughing loudly again. Frank asks a joking question about why the dead call him to work, and however, quite quickly the flow of messages stops, and bloody hieroglyphs appear on the smartphone. A split second later, a small red spirit in the shape of a human eye bursts out of the phone. The spirit demands that Frank immediately go to work, but the main character grabs him with his hand. Frank praises the spirit's creativity, but asks not to break his phone, otherwise he will crush it. The eye evaporates in Frank's hands, and he realizes that it was just another illusion. Frank puts the phone in his pocket and goes outside to grab his bike to go to work. Having reached the place of work, Frank looks at the remains of the building, trying to understand where he can find clues. Frank concludes that the building has burned to the ground, but some information can still be gleaned. Entering the main room, Frank meets all the employees who were listed as dead. Selena runs up to him first, telling him that he arrived very early today. Suddenly, Frank decides to touch Selena's breasts and asks her if her size is real, to which she only flirtatiously asks him to stop. Moving away from Selena, Frank climbs the stairs and meets Marty, who greets him anxiously. Frank returns the greeting and calmly asks Marty where Melvin is. Marty gives Frank directions, saying that Melvin is in his office now. Frank notes that everyone here looks too alive for the dead, wondering what really happened here. Walking into Melvin's office, Frank is met with a torrent of insults and questions about why he came so late. However, the main character ignores the attacks in his direction, asking Melvin where his bonus is. Melvin is surprised that Frank has the nerve to talk about the bonus, to which the main character says that Melvin annoys him even from the other world. Frank's eyes become bloodshot, and he begins to shout at Frank that he shouldn't talk to him like that. According to Melvin, he is the most alive, despite Frank's hopes. However, the stream of abuse from Melvin's mouth is abruptly interrupted by a precise blow with a scalpel. Frank slits Melvin's throat and pushes him forward, watching his bulky body fall to the floor. Frank looks contentedly at the writhing Melvin, telling him that he is already dead. Suddenly, Frank notices that all the employees got up from their jobs and fell into some kind of trance. Frank approaches Marty and waves his hand in front of his eyes, trying to bring him to his senses. However, Marty's face begins to distort right before Frank's eyes, and his eyes begin to squeeze out of their sockets. Frank looks on calmly, asking what's left of Marty if he's finished his transformation. Frank takes up his trusty scalpel and says he will stop this madness. Frank rushes into battle, quickly dealing fatal blows to all of the altered personnel. Frank looks wearily at all the dead creatures, asking them what they would say in advance when they have had enough. The creatures turn back into employees, filling the entire room with their blood. Suddenly, the entire building collapses, and with it the illusion that has been trying to fool Frank all this time. Frank comes to his senses somewhere in the middle of the corridor, seeing Marty and other survivors in front of him, tormented by nightmares. Suddenly, the corridor begins to pulsate violently, and darkness descends upon Frank again. The corridor is transformed into an ordinary school one, however. Not even a few seconds later, dark energy begins to flow from it. Very quickly, this energy transforms into a levitating something that looks at Frank with many eyes. The creature asks Frank how he can see through illusions, to which Frank replies that the illusions were indistinguishable from reality. However, from Frank's point of view, the creature did not take into account tactile sensations, and this is precisely what gave him away. The creature asks Frank why he is not afraid of him, to which he notes that relying only on his fear of death was a mistake. Frank adds that through all their tricks to scare him, they have ignited a fire within him that could destroy all his illusions. The creature examines Frank carefully, saying that it will remember him, calling him fearless. Frank notes that it was this creature that scared the nurse so much, believing that both the nurse and the entire hospital are one of the weakest illusions. Even though these beings can transform people, they cannot do it everywhere. Frank approaches the writhing Marty and remembers his touching words that he will follow him no matter what. After weighing the pros and cons, Frank takes a scalpel and cuts his throat to roll back time. Frank returns to the moment when they were just opening the exit door. He suggests that the surest way to overcome the illusion is lack of sleep. However, in practice, this decision did not help Frank, and he also ends up in the park, along with everyone else. Frank decides to try again, cutting his own throat again with a medical scalpel. Finding himself in front of the door again, Frank realizes that they will inevitably have to go to the illusory world. Frank tries to explain to everyone what awaits them behind this door, saying that they will have to remain strong and not give in to illusions. Frank puts his hand on Marty's shoulder, declaring that only he can save everyone. He adds that Marty will be able to touch Selena as soon as they get out of here. Marty blushes and asks Frank not to pressure him with such strong statements. However, despite all the motivating speeches, no one except Frank was able to overcome his fear of illusions. Frank convinces that everyone sees their own illusion, and everyone can pull themselves out of sleep only by themselves. However, Frank will still wake up Marty by calling his name. After several attempts, Frank hits Marty with his palm in an attempt to forcefully wake him up. Convinced that a simple blow does not produce results, Frank decides to try a few dozen more times. After even a blow to the groin had no effect, Frank decided to come up with another plan. Frank ends up trying the latter method and sticks a scalpel into Marty's leg. However, Marty only writhes in pain in response, after which he suddenly dies. Frank tries to figure out how to save Marty and gets lost in thought. After some time, a new plan comes to his mind, and he expresses hope that this time everything will work out. Having rolled back in time, Frank finds himself in the same corridor, but now Marty talks about his erotic dreams. The group of survivors find their way out, speeding up happily. Marty tells Frank that he will definitely find a woman's body to study as soon as they get out of here. It dawns on Frank, and he mentally concludes that despite the fact that Marty is timid and cowardly, his fear can be overcome with the help of feelings. Frank turns to Marty and asks him to turn up the volume on his phone. To a timid question, Frank replies that now they will watch his favorite film. It turns out that Marty is a big fan of adult films. Marty's favorite topic of these videos is being with the hottest teacher after school. Marty asks Frank if he is joking, since it is a very unfunny joke from his point of view. However, Frank gives Marty an unforgiving look, saying that he is saving his life. Marty agrees and goes online, opening the desired video, turning the volume up to maximum. The porn actress begins a vulgar monologue, and Frank tells Marty to close his eyes and do nothing as soon as it comes to this in his dream. The employees behind Marty hear suspicious noises from his phone and talk to each other about what he is watching. Marty continues to watch the videotape, and other survivors also approach him, interested in what is happening. After a few minutes of watching the video, Marty's love desire breaks out to a new level. After a few more minutes, Marty's desire peaks, and Frank decides it's time to call it a day. He tells Marty that it's time for them to move out while he's getting away from his good time. Frank reminds him not to forget this feeling when he is in danger, because this is what can destroy the illusion. Frank looks at the others with a careful look, and the group moves out into the darkness again, while Frank mentally notes that he even missed his wife a little. After some time, Frank breaks free from the captivity of illusions and notices that two of his companions are dead. Noticing with regret that they could not cope, he turns his gaze to Marty. Frank notices that Marty is clearly having a good time and makes some rather suspicious noises. Frank puts his hand to his head in embarrassment, but suddenly notices a strange aura. Streams of energy begin to emanate from Marty's body, who looks more alert by the minute. Frank realizes that Marty's power has awakened and he is about to awaken. After some time, Marty opens his eyes, shouting Selena's name. He jumps up, asking her not to run away, but little by little he comes to his senses. Marty looks around, asking Frank if he was able to find a way out. Frank is still impressed by Marty's cheerful movements, so he hesitates to answer. Marty begins to suspect that Frank is an illusion and decides to hit him, but he intercepts his blow. Frank begins to list all the searches he looked up on Marty's phone, making him blush. Marty asks him to stop and give him the phone, rushing at Frank, but he easily dodges. Marty, due to his recent awakening, still has difficulty controlling his body, so he loses his balance and falls. Having recovered from his fall, he notices that two corpses of his colleagues lie in front of him. Marty recoils in horror, but Frank tries to calm him down, saying that there is nothing they can do. Frank invites Marty along, pushing the heavy door forward, hearing a drawn-out creak. Together with Marty, they walk along a much less gloomy corridor towards a warm light. Having entered it, our heroes find themselves in the park and look around. Marty is glad that they got out, and Frank, having discovered familiar creatures from nightmares in the sky, shares his relief. He turns to his friend and asks him if he was awakened by chance. Marty replies that he actually felt an incredible surge of strength at a certain moment. Frank examines Marty carefully and asks him what his ability is. Marty honestly admits that he has no idea, but he heard from Wes that not all awakened people can use abilities. Frank is lying when he says that his ability is to predict the future. Marty says that now everything has fallen into place, and he understands how Frank knew where to go and where the danger lay. Frank looks to the sky and thinks that if there is an organization of espers in the world, then he will be able to quickly rise there thanks to his ability. He sums up his thoughts by telling himself that he needs to become even stronger in order to take revenge for everything. Frank's thoughts again permeate the images of his wife, and he plunges into pleasant dreams. However, Frank's attention is drawn to the fact that he still cannot see the building of the psychiatric hospital. Frank goes through his guesses, suspecting that the hospital and the office have merged, bringing the real world forward. Based on this, if Frank encounters some kind of monster, then the monster will not be able to attack him. But if they fall into another trap with doors, then things will be bad. According to Frank, even 1,000 rebirths may not be enough in the worst-case scenario. Frank turns to Marty and studies his behavior closely, trying to figure out one important thing. Realizing that Marty is behaving in exactly the same way, he asks him if he sees anything strange. Marty panics, begins to frantically look around, but does not notice anything serious. Frank continues to carefully watch Marty and make sure that he does not see anything otherworldly even in front of his nose. Frank and Marty head towards the exit, and the main character decides to ask his friend how he managed to get out of that dream. Marty begins to answer abstractly, saying that he gained knowledge from Frank's instructions and tried to penetrate the illusions. Frank notes to himself that he is the only one who was able to get out of the dream, but he had to kill himself in order to be able to see strange things. Frank stares at Marty and asks him if he did something dirty in his sleep. Marty blushes and begins nervously asking Frank what he means. Frank begins to outline the details of Marty's behavior, causing him to twitch in shame. Marty tearfully asks Frank not to tell anyone about what he saw and hears now, to which he receives a short consent. Marty says that when he opened his eyes, he found himself alone with the teacher from that video. However, very quickly, the image of the woman began to whisper frightening and evil thoughts to him. However, the woman did not loosen her grip and began to run her cold hands along Marty's torso. However, Marty remembered the trick that Frank had told him about and tried with all his might to turn his attention to something else. Frank listens to Marty's story with undisguised surprise, unable to give any comment. Thanks to Marty's efforts of will, a much more pleasant and romantic atmosphere bursts into the classroom. And instead of the teacher, the image of Selena begins to cling to Frank. The image of Selena stands defiantly at the table, beckoning him with her eyes to come closer. Marty can't stand it and takes off, pressing Selena against the wall and examining her body. However, in the blink of an eye, Selena turns into a terrible monster, assessing Marty with a hungry look and asking him if he is afraid of her. The creature grabs Marty's hands and opens its huge mouth, preparing to kill him. Marty admits that he was very scared, so he decided to act as decisively as possible. Gathering his strength, Marty frees himself from the monster's death grip, after which Marty firmly grabs the creature's shirt and rips it, getting to his chest. Frank mentally notes that he could not imagine that everything would be so terrible, and does not respond to this story. Marty tries to raise himself in Frank's eyes by giving abstract explanations for his action, but Frank declares that it is time for him to go home. Frank goes ahead saying that he will sleep off first, after which he will have a normal conversation with Marty. Marty is surprised that Frank is not embarrassed by the fact that all his colleagues have died, and the danger of encountering evil spirits still remains high. Frank asks Marty if he wants to report what happened to the police, to which he cannot answer. According to Frank, if there are all kinds of monsters and espers in the world, then without a doubt, there is an organization that will soon deal with them. Frank leaves, immersed in conversations with himself, telling himself that it is time to find her. Some time passes and Frank reaches his house late at night. Frank is greeted at the door by his wife, asking him if he is back and what he wants to cook. Frank, smiling, tells her that he has finally returned home. His wife immediately gives him a creepy look from her glowing red eyes. In a languid and contented whisper, she utters the familiar phrase that Frank sees her. However, further words are interrupted by the whistling of a scalpel in the air and the wet sound of an artery being cut. Blood begins to flow like a fountain from the neck of Frank's beloved wife, and she freezes in place, stunned. Frank happily throws punch after blow, saying that his wife is incredibly beautiful. However, suddenly the image of his wife bleeding disappears, and Frank again finds himself in front of the door. He again hears the crackling light bulb hanging on the door and the light hum of the night city. Frank stands in front of the door of his own apartment like a statue. After some time, Frank finally comes out of his stupor and asks himself whether he has really died. According to Frank, he doesn't even remember how it happened and wonders how she could have done it. Frank, still shocked by what was happening, tries to come to his senses and carefully turns the doorknob. Frank's wife greets him and he goes to his room, thinking that she turned out to be much stronger than he thought. Frank realizes that despite the awakening of the Esper's powers, there is still a huge gap between him and his wife. Meanwhile, in an unknown location, the Organization for the Control of Otherworldly Forces declares an emergency meeting open. Chairman Jason Todd says that the reason for the meeting was an incident at the Academy that occurred 5 hours ago. He adds that the area of the incident covers the Academy and the office buildings next to it, which means they cannot be sure that this area will not expand. The assistant tells Jason that images from cameras around the Academy will now appear on the screen. She adds that unfortunately, they were unable to access the cameras that were installed inside the Academy since they were destroyed, and all they have is an image of 2 survivors. The assistant reads out the dossier on Frank and Marty, and the chairman notes that he has not seen a single mention of their connection with the otherworldly before, realizing that until today they were ordinary people. The chairman asks those present what they think, and one of the participants says that even an ordinary person could get out of the territory of Level D, adding that the best option would be to clear out the survivors. An investigator named Catherine disagrees with him, saying that the tapes show that Frank is acting extremely calm for an ordinary person. Her advisor named Andy agrees. Even if Frank and Marty were ordinary people, there is a good chance that they could gain Esper abilities. Her opponent argues with her, saying that even a neophyte will understand that there is danger in this area, again emphasizing that they need to be cleared as soon as possible. Jason stops the argument by slamming his palm down on the table and ordering those arguing to be silent. The chairman tells Catherine to go to Frank tomorrow morning to see if he has supernatural powers or not. Catherine calmly listens to the chairman's demand and tells him that the order will be carried out. The next morning at first light, Frank's phone begins to ring. Frank wearily takes the phone and puts it to his ear, while his otherworldly wife asks him not to ignore her requests and wake up. The caller turns out to be Marty, who animatedly tells him that he finally realized what supernatural power he has. Frank asks what kind of supernatural force awakened in March, to which he answers that he will definitely be jealous. Marty says that he has awakened the power that every man dreams of, starting the story of what he tried yesterday with its help. Quickly realizing where this is going, Frank immediately hangs up the call. He begins to rub his eyes while trying to come to terms with the fact that his friend is the most hopeless person on the planet, but his phone starts ringing again. Frank picks up the phone and again, hearing Marty's voice, asks him what he needs, calling him a pervert. Marty continues to tell him about the features of his strength, saying that his body is becoming stronger and his inner spirit is strengthening. After a short introduction, Marty adds that the most important component of his power is his abnormally high potency. He begins to go into detail, and Frank again hastily hangs up the call, not wanting to listen to this information. Frank begins to prepare breakfast, mentally telling himself that he should have immediately realized that the manifestation of the Esper's power is a reflection of his soul. He admits to himself that he did not expect that after awakening Marty would acquire such an amazing ability, but quickly stops asking himself why he is even thinking about this. He places a plate of breakfast on the table and prepares to eat while his otherworldly wife watches him with a cheerful look. Meanwhile, an expensive official car of the organization drives up to his house and stops not far from his entrance. Investigator Catherine gets out of the car and asks the assistant if he listened to Frank and Marty's phone conversation. Andy replies that from the dialogue he understood that before they were both ordinary people, but during an incident at the academy, they acquired the abilities of Espers. Catherine asks the assistant about what powers they have, to which he replies that Frank's abilities are still not clear to him, after which he retells everything he heard from Marty. Catherine listens to the assistant's story, adding that March should work in a brothel. She adds that the organization now needs new personnel, so they need to check how strong Frank is. She also adds that Marty needs to be monitored so that he does not waste his energy. Meanwhile, Frank's wife sits down in front of him again, blocking his view, and asks him if he can see her. Frank ignores her and continues to watch TV, which says that the media still does not have any information about the incident at the academy. After a while, Frank hears a knock on the door and turns around, waiting for a while. Realizing that there is no longer a knock on the door, he decides to approach her, ignoring his wife's next requests to look at him. Frank carefully approaches the door, trying to understand whether there are people or otherworldly creatures behind it. Looking through the peephole, he sees that Investigator Catherine and her assistant are standing in front of the door. Assuming that since they can physically influence objects, they are definitely people. Frank opens the door for them. Andy begins to introduce himself, taking out his organization ID, but Frank quickly takes it and examines it carefully. Frank tells his guests that they arrived faster than he thought, adding that he has a conversation with them. Investigator Catherine and her assistant are surprised that Frank is acting as if he knew about their impending visit. Frank seats his guests on the sofa and notices that they do not see his wife or pretend that she is not there. He concludes that if they are Espers, they cannot help but see her, and then decides to find out as much as possible about them. Andy again introduces himself and Investigator Catherine, saying that the organization's goal is to discover everything otherworldly in order to maintain peace on Earth. Andy begins to talk in more detail about the organization, while Frank notices the attentive gaze of Investigator Catherine. Seeing the question in his eyes, she asks him how he found out about their organization. Frank replies that he did not know about the existence of the organization, however, He assumed that if it had not existed, the world would have been destroyed long ago. Catherine notices that Frank has retained his mental acuity after everything that happened, saying that he is not as simple as he seems. The investigator begins to talk about how their bureau is responsible for recruiting new personnel, adding that they specialize in countering supernatural forces. She continues her story, but before Frank's eyes, his wife again appears, desperately trying to draw the attention of her betrothed to herself. The wife moves closer and closer, trying to force Frank to look at her, examining his face very carefully. She asks him to look at her, asking if Frank loves her and thinks she is beautiful. Frank mentally wonders whether her wife will have the same satisfied face when she dies. Catherine finishes her story and tells Frank that they would like to know everything he knows about the incident at the academy. Frank replies that he wants to ask a few questions of his own before telling everything about the incident at the academy. Catherine does not appreciate this behavior and quickly flares up with a dark flame and becomes enraged. Assistant Andy tries to calm Catherine by asking her to breathe deeper and calm down. Frank says that he felt otherworldly forces in Catherine but does not see them in Andy. The main character expresses interest in the fact that an ordinary person was paired with an esper. He adds that the esper's emotional state is quite unstable, which often leads to incidents. Based on his guess, to compensate for his violent temper, a person who does not have the powers of sound mind and with a cold mind is paired with the esper. Assistant Andy tells Frank to ask his questions before it's too late, adding that he can't save him and he doesn't want to describe his death in the report. Frank asks his guests what otherworldly creatures really are. Andy answers that this is a fairly broad question that can only be answered in detail. He adds that otherworldly beings are perverted entities that do not have a specific form of manifestation, but have flesh and a certain appearance that makes each of them unique. India continues to talk about the creatures, adding that most often their appearance is unexpected and aimed at annihilating a person. He clarifies that otherworldly creatures feed on the spiritual power of a person, thereby strengthening their embodiment, and each of these entities is like an alien pollutant from which comes a continuous flow of energy that can penetrate a person and drive him crazy. He concludes his story by saying that there are espers who can redirect the flow of energy from creatures against themselves. Frank listens carefully to Andy's story and then asks him how the power of an esper is measured. Andy hesitates a little, telling the main character that he could already understand everything himself with a living example. He takes out a book and begins to explain to Frank that the level of strength and esper depends on the amount of redirected energy. His wife listens attentively to Andy's story and licks her lips, glad that she learned a little more about success. Andy says that espers are divided into ranks, adding that the first rank includes espers who have revealed their power by an amount from 1 to 20%. He adds that those who have revealed their strength by 21 to 40% belong to the second rank, but espers with strength from 41 to 60% belong to the third rank and can develop their abilities in different directions, after which they can move to higher ranks. Frank asks Andy if anyone has revealed their abilities to 100%. Andy replies that in all time no one has been able to reach this level, adding that the current maximum is rank 5. He says that in order to increase your level, you need to defeat an entity much stronger than yourself. However, with such a confrontation, creatures can also increase their strength and level, which can lead to dire consequences. Frank listens to Andy's story and decides to ask the assistant one last question. Catherine says they don't have time for such questions, ordering Andy to give Frank access to the worldwide database. Andy nervously drops his book and quickly answers, saying that he will do everything right now. Catherine warns Frank that the organization does not control the worldwide database, so he should not open messages from other users. She adds that this could end very badly for him and only he will be to blame for this. Frank says that he forgot to ask them another very important question, after which he points his fingers at his wife and asks his guests if they can see her. Catherine glances around the room and then looks at Frank with a look of complete incomprehension. Andy tells Frank that there is no one near him, mentally noting that according to their information, Frank is single. Frank's wife is delighted, rejoicing that he sees her, but this time for some reason she decides to further verify this by again asking him questions about whether he sees her. Andy quietly tells investigator Catherine that the aura around Frank is changing greatly, although before that everything was fine. He suggests that Frank began to have problems with his head after waking up. Catherine loses control of her emotions and asks Frank if he is making fun of them. Frank turns to his beloved and tells her that he sees her perfectly. Catherine tells Frank that if he doesn't want to cooperate, he can say so directly. However, her words are interrupted by an otherworldly wife who materializes in the world with familiar words that he sees her. She immediately begins to laugh evilly, beginning her metamorphosis into her true form. After a few seconds, she turns into a huge monster, saying that she hasn't eaten espers for a long time and they shouldn't expect mercy. Andy and Catherine jump up and look at the monster in horror, asking Frank what he is. Frank tells them that his wife is one of the otherworldly beings and bursts into mad laughter. Frank understands that his guests saw his wife after he answered her, which means some mechanism is triggered, forcing her to acquire physical form. Frank sums up that he is the only person in the world who sees foreign creatures with the naked eye, and therefore must be constantly prepared for dangers. Catherine decides to destroy the creature and sets her hands on fire with gouts of violet flame. She unleashes all her powers on the monster in the blink of an eye, setting it and half the room on fire. Frank watches Catherine carefully, noting that she instantly heated the entire room, concluding that her power is very great. However, as soon as the smoke clears, not a single scratch remains on the wife and she prepares for the attack. Catherine and Andy try to retreat, realizing that the monster in front of them is too strong. Frank's wife swipes her finger through the air, cutting it open and ordering the two to die on the spot. Catherine tries to tell the others to run faster, but the creature cuts off her head with a blow. Frank quickly runs up to the bodies of his guests, searching them, realizing that Catherine, judging by her clothes, really likes the color pink and notices a tattoo on her thigh, after which he finds a letter in Andy's pocket. Frank quickly unfolds the letter and begins to read it while his wife calls him and comes closer. She pounces on Frank and kills him in an instant, restarting time. Frank flashes back to the moment when he just returned home from the academy. He notes that the guests will arrive only tomorrow at 8:40 a.m., which means he has time to find out more about them. Frank sits down at the computer and decides to use everything the organization knows and uses the access to the database he received earlier. He enters the database, mentally telling himself that in any case he would have to seek outside help to resist otherworldly creatures. Frank hopes that he will be able to highlight some useful information from this forum. Climbing the pages of the forum, he tries to find out the truth about the other world. The main character notes that there is not too much information here, but it is still better than looking for everything on your own. However, quite quickly he stumbles upon an interesting post, access to which can only be opened for 1 million yuan. Frank reads further and finds out that basic information costs from 20,000 and the price for normal information reaches 1 million. Frank decides to look only at the free sections and opens an article that talks about a man who was able to control time. Frank carefully reads the article, which turns out to be just an ordinary internet joke that does not carry any useful information. The main character remembers the name of the author of the article and laments that he spent 5 minutes reading such nonsense. He finds the author of the article on the forum and sends her a welcome message. Somewhere on the other end of the line, an unknown girl receives a notification on her computer, and she decides to check it, wondering who decided to write to her at such a late time. Frank decides that he needs to search the forum for messages from representatives of the organization, since there is too much amateur content on this forum. After several hours of continuous searching, the sun rises over the city, illuminating Frank's room with its rays. Frank stretches wearily, realizing that he spent the whole night analyzing information on creatures and strange phenomena. During this time, he found out that otherworldly creatures are classified at least by strength, and they are divided into 5 classes. He also learned about recent cases of infection abroad caused by an otherworldly entity. Any Esper who had previously protected himself from infection could have dealt with it, but the speed of spread of the disease was so high that the organization had to wipe out the entire city from the face of the earth. He also recalls that this phenomenon was assigned the 2nd class of danger, while the 1st class includes the possibility of the complete extermination of humanity in the shortest possible time. Frank notes that, unfortunately, the reasons for the appearance of all these entities have not yet been identified or remain beyond the understanding of the human world order. Frank glances at the bed next to his wife and mentally tells himself that he cannot give any hint that he can see her. Frank understands that in all this time he has never found a person with a similar situation. He decides that he needs to save up money and energy to open paid posts on the forum. He also recalls that weapons are very diverse and have many types and forms. Frank remembers that the note said that the item could act as a repository for the essence's power. The main character carefully examines the scalpel, which he has kept with him since his escape from the academy. Frank looks at the time and notes that the organization has 3 hours left, which means he has time to try something. Concentrating on the otherworldly energy of the scalpel, he suddenly sees strange images in front of him, one of which asks him how desperate he is. Frank, who does not understand, asks the entity about its intentions. However, it is not eager to answer him. The entity inside the scalpel tells Frank that he now belongs to her and must obey. Focusing his mind, Frank absorbs the powers of the scalpel and subdues the unauthorized weapon. Frank notes that his powers are 20% awakened, saying that the scalpel can be used to enhance spiritual powers. Frank also notes that this enhancement had no effect on his muscle strength, expressing slight dissatisfaction. After a while, Marty calls him as before, and Frank immediately guesses the topic of his conversation. Marty begins to lament the fact that he was unable to surprise Frank and replies that he does not have time for this since guests are about to arrive. Meanwhile, Andy, on a trip with investigator Catherine, drops the wiretap phone in surprise. He again expresses surprise at Marty's abilities, but focuses on what Frank said. He tells Catherine that Frank can predict the future, greatly surprising her. Andy says that he heard from Frank's telephone conversation that he was expecting 2 guests right now. Catherine is surprised by what she heard, not completely believing that Frank had them in mind. Catherine admits that they miscalculated, as Frank turned out to be much stronger than one might have thought. She remembers that last week they tested an Esper who could teleport him, but he could only do it 10 centimeters. Andy talks about how Frank is the first, and on a completely different level. I'm interested in how far he can predict the future. The investigator and Andy arrive at the scene, and Catherine tells him that now they will test Frank's strength personally. Having gone up to the floor where Frank lives, Catherine and Andy find the front door open. Catherine opens the door and looks around the apartment with an attentive and inquisitive gaze. They find Frank pouring tea into 3 mugs placed on a table. Frank sits down and greets the guests, calling them by name and inviting them to sit at the table. Catherine sits down on the sofa, asking Frank how he knows their names and how many they will arrive. Frank tells her that he learned about their arrival thanks to the fact that his eyes can predict the future. Catherine expresses doubt about Frank's powers and asks him what evidence he has. Frank tells Catherine and her assistant that they are both members of an organization that is investigating an incident that happened at the academy, adding that they were tasked with finding out if his abilities awakened after the incident. Indy admits to Frank that he is amazed by his abilities, but what he said may be just a guess. Frank tells Andy that he can provide more solid evidence and reveals that he is secretly in love with investigator Catherine. The main character adds that Andy has an interesting letter in his right jacket pocket. Andy nervously grabs his jacket pocket, arousing the interest of investigator Catherine and Frank's wife, who makes fun of him. Frank continues to develop this theme by quoting lines from the love letter verbatim. Investigator Catherine decides to check Frank's words and climbs into her assistant's jacket, not paying attention to his shy excuses. Taking out the letter, she carefully studies it, noting that the contents of the letter exactly correspond to what Frank said. Catherine tells Frank that he cannot say for sure when the letter was written, even if he knows its contents. Frank tells Catherine that her ability is to control flames, adding that despite all this, he knows that her chest circumference is 85 centimeters. Catherine declares that her abilities are not kept secret. I am interested in how he was able to find out the girth of her breasts. Frank says that there is no secret in this, asking her if she wants to know the truth. Catherine tells him that she has nothing to hide, so he can calmly say so. Making a satisfied face, Frank tells Catherine that she is a big fan of pink since her underwear is that color, adding that she has a pink tattoo on her thigh. Catherine becomes furious when she tells Frank that he doesn't predict the future, he just sees through everything. Frank explains that last night he foresaw that they would arrive, and with the help of his power he saw Assistant Andy reading the letter and Investigator Catherine tidying up her wardrobe. The investigator calms down and invites Frank to write down the number of today's winning lottery ticket. Frank confidently writes the ticket number in his mind, telling himself that before the time rolls back, he will just look at the lottery result. Catherine asks Frank why he didn't buy all the winning tickets and get rich. Frank says that this would create a butterfly effect, adding that if the numbers don't add up, he'll just kill himself. Catherine gets tense again, and Andy calms her down by saying that there will still be a lottery that evening. Andy returns to the topic and asks Frank to talk about the events that happened at the academy. Frank plunges into memories and says that it was not an academy but a psychiatric hospital. He adds that everything happened very quickly as the floors in the room became larger and larger, and they did not even notice how the entire building ended up inside the hospital. Frank continues the story, mentally focusing only on what he had to face without mentioning the scalpel since it can keep useful secrets. He adds that everything happened exactly the way it did because of the weakness of his strength, since he could only look at situations individually after choosing a route. He adds that in only one of the outcomes, despite great losses, were they expected to be rescued, while in others they were constantly caught up and dismembered by a nurse. He also says that by his count, they encountered about 10 different creatures in this hospital. Assistant Andy and Investigator Catherine are surprised by this and say that there has never been a single precedent in the whole world when there were more than 10 creatures in one place. She adds that everything happens because of the desire of all entities to merge with our world while they can exist together with each other, which is why cannibalism is often common among them. She adds that his words could be true if the entity had a very strong leader who would keep them everywhere. Catherine concludes that judging by his words, Frank does not yet understand the essence of the existence of otherworldly creatures. Frank notes that ignorance is not a hindrance to existence, unlike arrogance. Catherine snorts with displeasure, and Andy's assistant invites him to ride along with them. Without thinking twice, Frank gets up and agrees, heading towards the exit of the apartment. An hour later, the car with the heroes stops in an inconspicuous place. Investigator Catherine's assistant Andy and Frank get out of the car and approach an abandoned-looking building. Frank follows his guests and reflects that other espers need special conditions that allow them to see the surrounding entities. He approaches the front door and expresses deep hopes for the organization, mentally asking it not to disappoint him. Once inside the organization, Frank is surprised that their base is deep underground, and the building above serves only as a cover. Frank overhears a conversation with a passing employee who says that he cannot borrow money. He manages to hear the outcome of the man's conversation, who ultimately agrees to lend his friend a small amount. Also, while passing by the offices, he notices how one of the employees accidentally touches his colleague by spilling water on her. Colleagues begin to quarrel because of this incident and make loud noise throughout the entire office. Walking into the break room, Frank sits down on a chair, saying that the organization has a rather cheerful atmosphere. Investigator Catherine asks Frank to wait here, inviting her assistant to follow the briefing to the main office. As soon as they leave, Frank notes that thanks to the adoption of powers and a scalpel, his ability to perceive has increased. He understands that his senses have become sharper and his reach has become wider, but he still cannot understand the size of this underground base. He decides to follow his recent companions and fix their otherworldly gaze on Catherine. Catherine suddenly turns around, sensing an otherworldly presence and looking around carefully. Advisor Andy is surprised by her behavior and asks her what happened, if anything unusual. Frank expresses regret that he was unable to follow them, but notes that Catherine's abilities are at an outstanding level. Meanwhile, in the director's office, Chairman Jason Todd asks Catherine who else knows about Frank's abilities, to which she tells him that besides his friend and the organization, no one knows about it. The chairman says that Frank's abilities cause him concern, asking him to additionally install a cart behind Frank's friend Marty. Jason looks at the lottery ticket that he hands over to him and asks him if it is a winner. The chairman examines the ticket, wondering whether Frank actually guessed the numbers or whether someone helped him. After some thought, the chairman says that he would like to see what Frank is capable of. The chairman speaks with investigator Catherine, asking her if she thinks Frank is a liar based on her experience as a senior esper. Catherine says that they have no evidence of his lack of abilities, so even if he is lying, he is definitely a professional at it. Chairman Jason is loudly surprised that no one except him doubts Frank's abilities. However, investigator Catherine invites Jason Todd to rely on her feminine intuition. The chairman says that they will still find out the truth about Frank's abilities tonight, and further asks about the 10 entities in the hospital that Frank spoke about earlier. Investigator Catherine says that judging by Frank's story, there were only 2 entities in the hospital. Otherwise, Frank would have been dead long ago. Catherine says that the first entity is a former hospital nurse who could kill only 1 victim at a time with a long interval between attacks, so she was assigned a 5th danger class. The second entity in the hospital was the demon plunging into the last sleep, which was assigned the 4th class of danger since it could put several people into sleep at once. Investigator Catherine summarizes her report by saying that the entire territory was assigned a 4th class of danger. Investigator Catherine says that this is where all the information she knows about the incident ends, and she has nothing to add. Jason ponders Catherine's report, marveling at the fact that a demon can kill with the help of dreams. Catherine says that if even a complete layman like Marty could survive, it would not be difficult for an esper to get out of sleep. The chairman asks to bring Frank, saying that he wants to look at him with his own eyes. Investigator Catherine shows concern, suggesting that Frank might pull some strange trick, asking him if it would be better to send him to the squad leader. Jason Toth replies that the commanders and his deputy are not at the base right now because they went to track down the head-like entity. Investigator Catherine asks if they will kill each other on this mission. Chairman Jason says that the commander named Brad and his second-in-command named Edward have a kind of rivalry going on. However, he is confident that they are a good team despite their strange relationship. After some time, Catherine comes to Frank with a device that determines the level of mental confusion. She says that all newcomers to the organization must take this test, to which Frank agrees without hesitation with his hand. What will he do if a strong otherworldly entity is rampant in the city? She offers Frank options for escape, rescuing the wounded or fighting a dangerous monster. Without thinking twice, Frank replies that he will choose to fight an otherworldly entity. Catherine looks at the readings of the device and realizes that he is telling the truth. I am surprised that Frank is ready to sacrifice himself. Frank mentally motivates his answer by saying that he despises these entities, so he will try to kill them again and again until he erases them from the face of the earth. Catherine outlines a hypothetical situation in which otherworldly entities have overcome humanity, and Frank has the chance to join their ranks, asking him if he will go over to the enemy's side. Frank answers without hesitation that he would never go over to the side of otherworldly creatures. Investigator Catherine is very surprised by this answer, not believing her own ears. She clarifies her question by saying that Frank can be offered unlimited power and protection for him and his loved ones. Frank still calmly tells her that he would never go over to the side of the enemy. Catherine asks Frank if his decision will change if his family is under threat, to which he replies that he has neither family nor friends. The investigator asks Frank about his relationship with Marty, to which he again says that he has no friends. Investigator Catherine asks Frank one last question, asking him what he will do when he becomes an esper. Frank tells her that he will destroy all otherworldly creatures on Earth. Catherine recalls that earlier subjects answered not at all as clearly as Frank, showing a high degree of perversity and selfishness. Most of the subjects admitted that they felt sympathy for otherworldly creatures and wanted to plunge the world into chaos. Compared to such contenders, Frank is a moral guide even for her. She admits to herself that she hasn't met a person for a long time who cares about other people. Catherine finishes by manipulating the device, checking it for damage. Meanwhile, Frank is immersed in his thoughts, promising himself not only to destroy all otherworldly creatures, but also to take revenge on his beloved wife. He tells himself that his wife cannot die too easily as she must feel everything he went through multiplied 1,000 times. Having completed the test, Investigator Catherine brings Frank to Chairman Jason Todd's office. She gives him the test results and he greets Frank politely. Jason introduces himself and invites Frank to sit down, carefully studying the test results. Looking up, he notices that Frank has already sat down at the table without waiting for the chairman's invitation. Frank accepts the chairman's invitation after the fact, carefully examining his interlocutor. Jason Todd is amazed by the test result, just in case there is an additional report. He takes out his glasses to make sure his eyes aren't deceiving him this time. He takes a quick glance at Investigator Catherine, not believing that she has a tattoo on her thigh. Having calmed down and put his glasses in the case, he turns to Frank, examining him carefully. He shakes Frank's hands with both hands, telling him that he is just an angel and is offering to join the organization. Frank replies that they have nowhere to rush since they can talk after the lottery results. mentally asking himself whether this is a test. The chairman notes to himself that Frank did not fall for such a trick, which means he will have to act differently, and asks Frank if there is a limitation on his abilities. Frank replies that in the hospital he was constantly between the past and the future, constantly experiencing the hardships of death and rebirth as if they could last forever. Frank adds that the future is just a scene that he can rewrite as he pleases. Investigator Catherine and Chairman Jason are surprised at Frank's determination, but decide not to say anything. The chairman says that at the moment the detachment commander and his deputy, who belongs to the second rank, are considered the most capable in the organization. Suddenly, an assistant runs into the chairman's office and says that a terrible event has happened. He says that the squad's deputy commander named Edward, throwing investigator Catherine and the chairman into incredible shock. Frank mentally wonders how strong Edward's ability was since he was classified as the second rank, saying that he would like to gain his powers. The assistant says that Edward found a dangerous entity located on the outskirts of the city. He adds that while he was trying to deal with her, another one attacked him out of nowhere. Based on the assistant's story, due to the effect of surprise, the entities managed to defeat Edward and kill him. Chairman Jason goes into a rage and asks his assistant how they could not know another entity. He fearfully admits that after conducting a reconnaissance operation in that area, they did not detect any more entities. The chairman asks him where Brad is now, to which he replies that his squad is already on its way to the abandoned building. The chairman asks the assistant to escort Frank to the break room, ordering investigator Catherine to follow him. Frank calmly gets up from his seat and follows the assistant, carefully listening to the surrounding conversations. He manages to hear that the organization will prepare 10 incense and 3,000 coins. The main character recalls that he saw all the organization's developments on the forum, but never encountered them in person. He remembers that coins, or rather the steel from which they are made, can serve as a good conductor of spiritual energy. So it is from it that all the necessary tools for fighting otherworldly creatures are made. He also remembers that incense is needed to cleanse from filth and help bring a distraught Esper to his senses. Frank reflects on the fact that even the first organization can die so easily when faced with just 2 entities. However, he quickly remembers that the nurse was also a strong opponent who could not be penetrated with conventional weapons. Frank notes that from the outside, this whole situation looks pretty hopeless. In his opinion, people may forever remain in a losing position due to the weakness of their body and spirit. Frank gets up and tells the people leaving not to worry. He knocks out the assistant, saying that he will not be as weak and will try to tip the scales on his side. Dressed as an assistant, the main character decides to go on reconnaissance and find out more about the organization. Frank carefully walks through the organization, listening to disturbing gossip and employees. Frank overhears conversations that Edward was dissatisfied with the fact that Brad received the title of the strongest squad, despite the fact that his ability to achieve eternal luck cannot compare with Edward's abilities. He also hears that Edward had no equal in strength in the organization, and his loss seems to people something incredible and impossible. Frank is interested in Brad's abilities, mentally telling himself that manipulating luck is a very useful skill. Employees say that during one of the competitions in the past, Edward could not use his full strength due to health problems, and Brad took advantage of this. Despite health problems, Edward did not cancel the competition, since in a real battle the entity would not have spared him. Frank admits to himself that rumors spread incredibly quickly. One of the employees calls Frank over and says that an emergency meeting is about to begin. All other employees rush to the conference room, and Frank expresses the hope that there will be more interesting information at the meeting. Taking advantage of his disguise, Frank quietly slips into the hall and decides to quietly listen to the speakers. Thick cigarette smoke begins to fill Chairman Jason Todd's chair. Frank is surprised that someone allows themselves to smoke so much at such a moment. He decides to look at the source of the smoke and finds squad leader Brad sitting in the corner. The squad leader, Brad, with a heavy voice, pronounces Edward's name, and Frank notices a huge number of cigarette butts lying around, suggesting that they had a fairly close relationship. Chairman Jason points to the screen behind him, saying that it depicts an entity codenamed Braken. He adds that based on the information received, this entity has incredible speed, strength, and the ability to hide in the shadows. The chairman emphasizes that this entity can dissolve in space, and that is why Edward could not inflict any damage on it. However, the entity, taking advantage of its incredible powers, dealt cruelly with him. The chairman continues the story by saying that Brad's squad quickly dealt with the first entity, but then retreated because they did not have enough strength to defeat Bracken. The chairman says that they will gather all their resources and strength to avenge Edward. He also adds that amidst all these adversities, they can congratulate Brad on his promotion to the 3rd rank, which means entry into the top of the espers. Employees near the market are whispering about how there is no esper with such a rank in any country in the world. Frank reflects on the fact that only 41% of those with the power were able to awaken their abilities and wonders whether Brad's ability to manipulate luck helped Brad achieve 3rd rank. Brad rises to his feet, leaving a trail of cigarette butts behind him, showing no interest in his promotion. He checks his pockets and then takes out an empty pack of cigarettes and shakes it. Making sure that it is empty, he turns around and asks those present if they have any cigarettes. Chairman Jason Todd tells him that he is a 3rd-rank esper, which means he will soon be responsible for protecting the city from entities. Seeing that Brad is not listening to him at all, he raises his voice, demanding that he come to his senses. However, Brad simply turns around and leaves, saying that he is going to buy himself some cigarettes. The chairman slams his fist on the table, ordering him to return and asking him if he wants to take revenge on them. Brad freezes in place and, without turning around, asks the chairman if they are able to take revenge. Understanding what Brad was getting at, the chairman depressingly puts his hand to his forehead and falls silent for a while. After a few seconds, he takes a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket and throws them at Brad, telling him to use them. Brad sits down and takes out a cigarette, asking the chairman about when he started smoking, to which he only receives a request not to ask questions. Frank watches Brad with interest, noting that he is calm and reserved even after the death of his friend and does not show any signs of clouding his mind. Suddenly, Frank's assistant, who had been knocked out earlier, bursts into the conference room. The chairman bangs his fist on the table, demanding silence, and threateningly asks the assistant about what happened to him. The assistant replies that the person he brought into the break room knocked him out and ran away, taking his uniform. The chairman demands that full readiness be declared and that the escaped Frank be found. Frank notices that the assistant quickly woke up, telling himself that he would need to improve his technique. However, while thinking, Frank does not notice that they have already identified him and pointed a weapon at him. The chairman tells Frank that it is better for him not to even know what awaits him for attacking the investigator. Brad, however, doesn't pay any attention to Frank, so he calmly approaches him. He sits down and asks Brad if he wants to bring his friend back to life. Brad replies that Frank shouldn't make jokes about the dead at such a moment and piss him off. Brad looks up sternly at Frank, who mentally notes that he gives off a very strong aura. Frank tells him that he is completely serious and asks him again if he wants his friend back. Chairman Jason Todd tells Frank that he is surrounded and asks him what he means. Brad gestures to the employees to use their weapons and sadly says that the dead cannot be brought back. He tells Frank that he might be angry with him, but his words gave him hope, asking him if he could really resurrect his friend. Frank tells Brad that he needs to know where and when his friend died and how far he was from him. Brad says that he was carried into the mountains near the city, regretting that he was not closer to that place. He expresses confidence that if he had been closer, his friend would definitely have remained alive. Frank says that's enough and asks Brad to give him his hand so he can show him his secret. Brad asks Frank what he means by his promise to resurrect his friend. Frank tells Brad that he cannot resurrect his friend right here and now. However, Frank adds that he can turn back time to prevent Edward's death. Chairman Jason Todd speculates that this is something more than resurrecting the dead and suggests that Frank is bluffing. Brad asks Frank why he is so cool and where he gets his powers. Investigator Catherine recalls Frank's story that in the hospital he moved between the past and the future, caught in an endless cycle of death and rebirth. Frank's phrase pops up before her eyes about how he can change the future, and she realizes that Frank's power is time travel. Meanwhile, Frank tells Brad that he will go back in time and send him a message that Edward is in danger, but he needs to come up with a code word so that Brad from the past will believe him. Frank asks Brad if he is ready to try and trust him with such a secret. Brad says that he has nothing to lose and gives him his number, adding that he will have to direct him by phone since he suffers from topographic cretinism. Brad also says that he will reveal a secret that for many years was only between him and Edward. Brad gathers his strength and admits that during the competition for the title of Best Esper, he poisoned his friend in order to win. Everyone present falls into deep shock from what they hear, freezing in surprise. The chairman admits that he would never have thought of such a thing, asking Brad how he dared to do such a thing. Brad tries to justify himself by starting to tell the story, but quickly changes his mind. Frank tells Brad that such a revelation will be enough, and it will definitely work at the right time. Frank turns to everyone present and says that they can ignore them and continue the meeting. Brad tells Frank that everyone is waiting for his next steps when he returns to time. Frank says that he won't be able to go back in time right now and they will have to wait a little longer. The chairman yells at Frank and Brad, ordering them to go to the isolation room and talk there without interfering with the meeting. Brad looks around the conference room and turns to Frank again, pointing his finger at the door, inviting him to follow him. Once in the isolation ward, he tells Frank that the chairman is worried about him, so he shouldn't take it seriously. He admits to himself that the return of his best friend depends only on Frank, so he needs to be as careful as possible. Frank asks Brad about the abilities of his best friend Edward and asks him to tell him more about them. Brad silently takes out a cigarette and slowly lights it with a lighter, taking a leisurely drag. Brad formulated his thought and says that Edward's strength is super speed, due to which he has a strong advantage during battle. Several hours pass over a long conversation and the sun begins to set. Investigator Catherine and Chairman Jason Todd burst into Frank's detention center and accuse him of not matching any of the numbers on the lottery ticket. They give Frank a comparison of the correct ticket numbers and the numbers he wrote and offer to see for himself. Brad looks at Frank with disappointment and tells him that he shouldn't have mocked the dead after all. Frank carefully examines the winning ticket number and asks the investigator if it is truly genuine. Investigator Catherine tells him that the numbers on the tickets are real, asking him why he deceived them earlier by saying that he predicted them. In response to the accusation, Frank calmly takes his scalpel out of his pocket, sparkling with shiny steel. He gets up and tells everyone present that now it's time to get to work. His interlocutors misunderstand Frank's intentions and prepare to attack, demanding that he put down the scalpel. Taking advantage of their confusion, Frank hits himself in the head with a scalpel, instantly killing himself. Returning back in time, he immediately writes the number of the winning ticket on a piece of paper. Without further incident, he is interviewed by investigator Catherine and her assistant and goes to the organization. Arriving at the organization's office, Frank tells his companions that one of the employees will now answer the call. After a few seconds, the employee picks up the phone and begins a familiar conversation about how he doesn't lend money. Walking further, he tells his companions that one of the employees will now decide to reach out for money to a passing colleague. Everything happens exactly as he says, and this turns out to be a strong impression on investigator Catherine. She turns towards Frank and asks him if he foresaw all this in advance. Frank goes further and approaches the doors, saying in advance that behind them there is a recreation room. Having entered it, he takes out cups from the cabinets and brews tea, handing it to the investigator and advisor. Investigator Catherine correctly guesses that Frank has been here before and asks him a direct question. However, Frank silently takes out sugar and puts 5 cubes in Investigator Catherine's glass, having previously remembered this from the last time. The main character repeats that he can see the future and says that the chairman is now free and ready to receive them with reports. Meanwhile, Brad is quickly driving his car to his assignment when he suddenly hears someone calling him. He quickly picks up the phone and asks who is calling him at such a time. Frank tells Brad that in half an hour his best friend Edward will die, and he turns around, his face changing in fear. Brad asks Frank who he is, to which he replies that he can predict the future and asks him to go to Edward as soon as possible, otherwise he will die again. Brad says he doesn't know any Frank, emphasizing that now is not the time for jokes, to which he tells the story of how he poisoned Edward during a squad competition. Brad asks Frank in surprise how he knows this, emphasizing that he has never told anyone about this before. Frank tells him that in the building where Edward is currently fighting, there is another entity that will unexpectedly attack him and kill him. Brad presses the gas pedal to the floor and rushes at full speed to help his friend. Frank hangs up, mentally saying that now Edward's life is only in his hands. Meanwhile, investigator Katrin brings a sensor and offers to take a test for mental fog. Mentally, she decides to make sure once and for all whether Frank is deceiving her or not. Frank calmly puts his hand on the sensor and says that he is ready to begin, causing Catherine to ask questions about when he had time to prepare. Catherine begins to ask the first question. However, her friend cuts her off mid-sentence, answering that he will accept the fight. Catherine is very surprised, and Frank continues to predict her questions and immediately answer them. The main character answers the third question, repeating again that if he happens to the first one, he will destroy them all. Having answered all the questions, Frank gets up from the table and says that the interrogation is over, leaving investigator Catherine to sit stunned for some time. After some time, Frank enters the chairman's office and he tells him that he has exceeded all his expectations, asking him to prove that he can really predict the future. Frank says that there is not a single Esper on Earth who could compete with him in strength. The chairman turns to investigator Catherine asking for test results, but she remains absent-mindedly silent. Investigator Catherine says that she did not write a report because Frank himself asked and answered all the questions, while the device did not notice the presence of filth or signs of a clouded mind. Frank mentally thinks that he needs to show at least some weak point in his ability to convince them. Frank admits that despite the opportunity to unhinderedly observe the future, to restart he needs to pay a big price, namely clouding of reason. The main character explains that he cannot predict for a long time, otherwise he will have to pay dearly for it, adding that this is why he needs to join the organization in order to maintain his mental state in order. The chairman reflects on what Frank said, noting that there is some logic to it. He asks Frank about what he expects from working here, adding that therapy turns out to be mandatory for all Espers. Frank says that he needs the salary of a second-rank Esper, as well as a bonus and incense every month, adding that for his ability to work, money plays a decisive role. The chairman replies that if Frank can prove that he still has abilities, then he will arrange all this. Frank says the chairman never seems to understand how important it is to anticipate the future. He adds that he prepared the gift so that no one would have such questions again. The chairman warily asks Frank to mentally note that he does not like the direction this situation is heading. Frank pointedly states that he has prepared Edward's life as a gift to the organization. The chairman of Infidelity reads Frank's intention and asks him not to threaten him with Edward's life. Frank suggests calling Edward right now to make sure his words are true. The hero's conversation is interrupted by Brad, who rushes headlong into the chairman's office, provoking him to scream. He asks the chairman where a man named Frank is right now. The chairman, confused, asks him what he is doing here, reminding him that he and Edward had a joint mission. Brad replies that Edward was seriously injured and is now in the hospital, again asking where Frank is. Catherine grabs Frank by the shoulder and asks him what he did to Edward. Edward mentally notes that apparently Brad almost managed to save his friend. The chairman tells Brad that Frank is right in front of him, adding that he previously talked about a certain gift. He looks sternly at Frank and asks him if this is really his gift. Brad happily approaches Frank, looking down at him. He hugs Frank tightly, saying that he is very grateful to him for saving him, adding that if it weren't for Frank, Edward would definitely not be alive. Looking at the amazed faces of investigator Catherine and the chairman, Frank asks them if they are satisfied with his gift. After some time, he turns his gaze to Brad and asks him not to squeeze him so tightly. Investigator Catherine is at a loss as to how Frank was able to save the life of the best Esper with just one phone call. The chairman says that if Edward was saved because of Frank's tip, then his powers have become extremely important and asks Investigator Catherine to take Frank to the break room. He asks Brad to stay, so he whispers to Frank that he will find him a little later. After some time, Investigator Catherine sits with Frank in the rest room, thinking that he guessed her abilities and found out about her tattoo. Catching Frank's gaze, she mentally wonders why he was staring at her neck. Meanwhile, Frank reflects on the fact that Investigator Catherine's neck is as long and snow-white as his wife's, fighting the urge to cut her throat, but he quickly switches to thoughts about how his wife will bleed. After some time, Brad comes into the restroom and asks Investigator Catherine to leave them alone. Investigator Catherine fearfully leaves the room, surprising Brad with her behavior. Brad smiles widely at Frank and asks him if he told anyone else that he poisoned Edward. Frank is mentally surprised that the chairman was wary when he found out and saw his abilities in action, but Brad doesn't care about all this at all and is only concerned about keeping the secret. He tells Brad that this will remain only between them, and Brad breathes a sigh of relief. However, Frank immediately adds that this is not accurate information, confusing Brad. He says that Frank needs to join the organization offering to work under him. Frank says he will do it and keep Brad's secret a secret for 100 coins. Brad calls this amount robbery, saying that Frank is not even on the team yet, to which the main character responds that now the price of the service has increased to 200 coins. Brad says he gives up, adding that he is indebted to Frank for his help and sadly parts with 200 coins. After some time, Frank, Catherine, and Brad come to the chairman's office, and Brad asks Catherine if she can lend him a few coins. Catherine angrily replies that his salary is 4 times higher than hers, so she will not lend him anything, and Frank mentally notes that he should have milked Brad and not taken everything at once. Meanwhile, the final stage of the lottery begins and the presenters begin to spin the drum. Frank guesses the number of the winning ticket, and Brad happily hugs him and says that from today he is his brother. The chairman yells at Brad, saying that Frank's abilities are negatively affecting his sanity, so they shouldn't be wasted on such nonsense. Jason Todd says he's convinced Frank has powers, so everyone will keep it a secret from the others. He formally invites Frank to join the organization, adding that all his demands will be met. Frank agrees, and Brad asks the chairman how he is going to keep Frank's powers secret, to which he replies that he will be included in the register of espers under the heading of Top Secret. Frank is assigned the call sign Prophet, and he mentally rejoices that with the resources of the organization, he is one step closer to his revenge. Brad asks the chairman if the chairman is afraid that Frank will be taken away if they find out about his power. He is also interested in why Frank was added to the register, but he is not, additionally indignant at the fact that Frank immediately became the first of the 5th rank. The chairman replies that now the number of strange incidents in the world has increased, so Frank was allowed to rise above all of them, expressing confidence that even if Frank decides to leave them, his merits and contribution to preserving the world will forever remain with them. He also adds that Frank's friend named Marty will also be accepted into the organization since they survived the events of the hospital together. Mentally, he adds that this should bring Frank closer to the organization and, in an emergency, play into their hands. Investigator Catherine adds that Frank's ability sometimes has overly obscene manifestations. The chairman expresses confidence that everything will work out, adding that Frank will become more steadfast thanks to his work in the organization. The chairman's words are a mental expression of dissatisfaction with the fact that they are accepting Marty's team. The chairman turns his attention to Brad, asking him to describe in more detail the entity in which they had to face. Brad suggests that this monster was created by man, adding that he unfortunately does not have sufficient evidence. He says that the entity consisted entirely of something similar to smoke or other substance, adding that during the battle he behaved too humanly. Brad adds that it was only due to his luck that he was able to avoid the fatal blows. According to him, the behavior of the entity was strange because it constantly moved like water, and at the moment when Brad tried to attack, he retreated, as if expecting this. Brad also takes out the Ace of Spades card, adding that he found it at the battle site. Frank asks Brad if this card was created by the entity, or if the entity used it during the battle. The chairman says that if the monster left a map, then most likely it was an esper, which means they were faced with an enemy that had never been seen before and behind which an entire group could stand. Jason concludes that the situation is too complicated and says that a deeper investigation needs to be carried out, after which he orders investigator Catherine to show Frank how everything works. After a few hours of the market, he returns home and sits on the sofa in the company of his otherworldly wife. He looks at his new agent ID and dumps a bunch of coins out of his bag. He examines the coin, guessing it could be worth millions on the black market. Frank notes that Captain Brad made good money, adding that if he were not an esper, he would have to trade in something more interesting. Frank notes that instead of blackmail, he thanked him for saving Edward, coming to the conclusion that there is a strong connection between them. After that, he thinks about how he can profit from these coins. Frank begins to look at his options, thinking about buying armor, but refuses because the chance of dying is already too high. He begins to think about weapons, but also refuses, deciding that a scalpel is enough for him. The main character understands that, in fact, he does not need a weapon capable of striking on the spot. Instead, it should be light, ergonomic, and sharp to penetrate the enemy's defense. He looks at his scalpel, saying that it is perfect even though it is clearly not Excalibur. Frank decides that he needs to order a weapon like a scalpel that can easily disguise an ordinary object. He also thinks that the rest of the coins can be sold on the black market for a lot of money and become rich. However, his thoughts are interrupted by a sudden knock on the door and he looks up in surprise. Frank understands that if it had been Marty or someone from the organization, they would definitely have called him before arriving at such a late time. He decides to approach the door and look through the peephole to identify his guest in advance. Looking into the hole, he encounters a red eye emitting a mysterious glow. Frank's vision becomes clouded and he loses the ability to think soberly, falling to the ground. After a while, he opens his eyes and a sharp smell of rot fills his nose. Frank looks around and notices bloody hooks, forceps, and other medical instruments. Having fully recovered, he feels heavy metal chains on his body and mentally asks himself where he is. He also notices a huge number of otherworldly creatures surrounding him, closely watching him. Looking around the room, he discovers a man who is busy repairing the grinding mechanism. After some time, the man turns to Frank and asks him if he has woken up. Frank carefully studies the man and the room in which he is located, remaining silent. Frank mentally assumes that he was the one he saw through the peephole before his abduction. The man says that Frank woke up quite quickly, which means he is not a new Esper, adding that unfortunately he loves to tear such talents to pieces. Frank suggests that the man's strength lies in his strange red eyes. Over time, Frank recognizes the long face of his opponent and guesses that he is Wes's cousin, who was previously killed by a nurse in the hospital. The man introduces himself as Dredd, saying that he really is Wes's cousin, calling him a loser. He says that unfortunately, he has begun to kill less and less, adding that the car is already pretty worn out, but he will soon fix it, so Frank doesn't have to wait long. Frank asks Dredd to fix the car quickly because he doesn't like wasting time. Dredd bursts into mad laughter, not believing that Frank is in any way interested in his work. He adds that Frank will be in a coffin before he can blink and bursts out laughing again. Frank carefully studies Dredd's behavior, remembering that this is exactly how the forms describe the loss of sanity among Espers. Frank tells Dredd that his brother tried to drag him to the next world by clinging to his trouser leg with bloody hands and asks him if he knows what he answered him. Dredd, with a grimace distorted from insane anger, asks Frank what he answered him. Frank, with an evil grin, says that he crushed Wes's hand, breaking it off at the bone, adding that his screams became a real delight to his ears. Dredd becomes enraged, insulting Frank and telling him that he should die right now. He promises Frank that he will put his corpse through a meat grinder and feed it to stray dogs, asking him if he is afraid of this fate. Frank calmly replies to Dredd that he is an ordinary loser who fell to the very bottom and lost his mind. Dredd calls Frank names again, mentally telling himself that he will make him crawl on his knees begging for mercy. He says that he will make Frank regret every word he said to him and his brother. He promises Frank that he will torture him to death and will not leave a living wound on him. Dredd begins to sort through torture instruments, trying to figure out which one is best. Frank watches him calmly and mockingly asks him how long it will take him to choose instruments. Dredd orders Frank to shut up and is overcome by a mental attack, forcing him to repeat this order several dozen times. Dredd takes out tongs and says that he will pull out Frank's teeth one by one, demanding that he beg for his life. Frank interrupts Dredd's gloating and asks him how he wants to die. He continues to ask leading questions, asking whether Dredd wants all his bones broken or simply ground into minced meat. Dredd is briefly put off by Frank's behavior as he continues to reason, advising him to choose between beheading and flaying. He adds that he is not a professional in these matters, so after hundreds of cuts, Dredd may already be dead if he does not bleed out first. However, Frank expresses high hopes that Dredd will be able to endure this and suffer for a long time. Dredd asks Frank who he is, calling him a complete madman. Dredd begins to wave the tongs, saying that it is he who decides who should die here, so Frank does not dare threaten him. Frank tells him that he is wrong and his fate is in his hands. Suddenly, Frank turns to one of the otherworldly entities and tells her that she has been looming here for half a day, asking her if she wants to eat Dredd. Dredd looks at Frank blankly and asks him who he is talking to. Frank tells him that he is speaking from an entity that has come after his soul, and the space next to him begins to distort. A huge monster crawls out of the distorted funnel, and Dredd looks at it with a look full of horror. He turns to Frank and angrily shouts at him that it's all because of him, accusing him of being crazy. Frank says that there are many of these entities here and orders them all to appear. A few seconds later, several more monsters invade the material world from the distorted space. Dredd looks at them with eyes full of despair and shouts that this is all impossible. Frank happily watches as the monsters devour Dredd and then move towards him. A few seconds later, he again finds himself on the sofa, surrounded by his gentle wife, who joyfully greets him. Frank leans back on the couch and admits to himself that being eaten alive isn't such a bad thing. After some time, there is a knock on his apartment again, and this time the main character decides to approach the door fully armed. He takes out a scalpel and heads towards Tver while his wife asks him if the bones have come to him, to which he only mentally says to himself that someday he will allow her to feel all his torment. He adds that this will not happen in the near future since he promised her the most terrible death. With the thought that a man must keep his word, he approaches the door this time without looking through the peephole. Dredd mentally tells himself that he hears Frank's steps and begins to look intently through the peephole, waiting for him to appear at the door. Leaning closer, he only manages to notice Frank's silhouette, after which a sharp scalpel pierces his eye through the hole. Howling in incredible pain, Dredd grabs his crippled eye, trying to hold back the gushing blood. He screams that he is in incredible pain and falls to the ground, slowly losing consciousness. Unable to withstand the painful shock, Dredd loses consciousness and crashes onto the cold floor of the entrance. Frank opens the door and carefully leaves the apartment, deciding to drag Dredd inside and search him. Frank tells himself that he does not like to play trump cards himself, but he is disgusted when they are used against him. Frank, in the company of his curious wife, searches the body and examines all the documents that are on it. Dredd has a wallet, a phone, keys, some change, and a coupon for visiting a brothel. Frank notes that these things give off a strange aura and takes one of the unusual artifacts from Dredd. He notes that one of the objects has the strongest aura and examines it with interest. Frank puts some kind of candlestick on the table, mentally telling himself that Dredd even had some kind of weapon, despite the fact that he still succumbed to the scalpel. Frank also assumes that Dredd is a low-ranking Esper since he was able to knock him down with one blow. While searching Dredd's phone, he stumbles upon a certain Enlightenment Club, which is an organization created by Espers from people whose minds have been distorted by entities, as well as information about ordering incense. Mentally remembering that incense does not restore the Esper's mind, but only calms him down, Frank stumbles upon recordings from video cameras that show that Dredd ordered delivery to his warehouse. Frank admits to himself that he sincerely feels sorry for the courier who ran into the already distraught Esper. After rummaging through his phone for some time, Frank finds out the address of the warehouse where Dredd kept him. Delighted with his quick wit, Frank grabs Dredd and throws him over his shoulder. After a while, Dredd comes to his senses, looking around and trying to figure out where he is. Having fully regained consciousness, Dredd realizes that he is in his own warehouse. Having tried to move, he notices that his arms and legs are shackled with iron chains. Suddenly, from the darkness, someone shouts out to him, forcing him to pay attention to himself. Frank finishes fixing the grinding machine and tells Dredd that he slept too long. He decides to check the result of his work and presses the button, setting the blades of the monstrous installation in motion. Asks Frank who he is, but he replies that he is the one he tried to break into yesterday. Taken aback by what he saw and not believing his eyes, Dredd pronounces Frank's name. Frank says that he guessed right, adding that if he is a good boy, he will do everything quickly and painlessly. He leans over to Dredd and says that he was going to cut out his eyes so that he would not use his abilities, but he wants him to personally enjoy his demise. He puts a scalpel to Dredd's remaining eye and repeats that his life is in the balance. Dredd justifies himself by saying that he never had anything against Frank and thought that he was just a new Esper, so he wanted him to join the Enlightenment Club. Frank sarcastically asked Dredd if he wanted to kill him to avenge his brother. Dredd is mentally surprised that Frank found out about his plan for revenge, assuring the protagonist that he never thought about it, and adding that he doesn't care about his brother's death. Frank says that this won't happen and he shouldn't separate the family. Then he swings a scalpel. After a split second, he says that he will simply finish him off and delivers a swift blow to Dredd's body with a scalpel. Dredd screams in pain, mentally thinking that Frank blew his guts out with one blow. He looks down and to his surprise discovers that such pain is caused by only a small abrasion left by an otherworldly scalpel. He turns on Frank, calling him crazy and asking him what kind of knife he has. However, Frank strikes again, causing Dredd to howl again in unbearable pain. Frank continues to torment Dredd, inflicting dozens of blows with a scalpel, torturing his offender. After some time, Dredd begs Frank to just finish him off and end his suffering once and for all. Frank tells Dredd that he seems to be returning to normal and suggests playing a question-and-answer session. Having received quick consent from Dredd, Frank asks him a question about what the bronze candlestick is for. Dredd replies that he is needed to protect against the attacks of the entities, adding that their leader lent him to reduce the otherworldly influence on Dredd. According to him, the candle is soaked in special blood, and when it is set on fire, its light scares away all entities, but if there is a lot of entity, then the candle will burn out faster. Frank asks Dredd about how much he was able to awaken and why he lost control in the end. Dredd replies that he awakened by 20% and became practically an esper of the second rank. However, he could not cope with the opened flow of spiritual energy. His mind began to quickly become clouded. Frank demands that Dredd tell him everything about the Enlightenment Club, its members, their level of awakening, and their abilities. Dredd says that the participants have sufficient freedom and there is no point in hiding something, adding that he knows for sure that the leader of the club is a second-rank esper. Half an hour later, the internet says that it told him everything, asking him to finally kill him and end his suffering. Frank tells Dredd to take his time, adding that there are still a couple thousand cuts left to make. Dredd curses Frank, calling him a liar, and tries to bend over in his chair to use his eye on him. However, Frank steps aside, not allowing Dredd to carry out his plan, and inflicts several more blows on him with a scalpel. Dredd screams loudly, filling the entire space of the warehouse with his cries of pain. He has a mental attack and starts screaming to kill him right now. Dredd begins to fall into a state of eerie trance, continuing to repeat requests and pleas for death. His eye begins to move from side to side at incredible speed and foam begins to come out of his mouth. After a while, he falls silent, stops twitching, and freezes motionless in place. Frank is surprised that Dredd suddenly fell silent and decides to hit him to bring him to his senses. However, Dredd does not react. Instead, his body begins to become covered in strange blue blisters. After some time, all the blisters burst simultaneously and streams of dark blue energy begin to emerge from them. Frank suggests that Dredd has completely lost his mind and gone completely crazy. He admits that this is the first time he has seen such metamorphoses take place with an esper and decides to interrupt them now by delivering a quick blow with a scalpel. However, Frank unexpectedly gets carried away and instead of one blow begins to shred Dredd's body. When Frank comes to his senses, Dredd's arms and legs fall to the stone floor with a thud. Dredd continues to sit in place for some time, fixing his empty gaze on the ceiling as if not paying attention to the blood gushing from the severed limbs. However, after a few moments, his lifeless head bows down and he stops showing even the slightest signs of life. Frank examines Dredd's body, assuming that he did not die from the transformation and regretting that he maimed him too much. He decides to wipe the scalpel from traces of blood when suddenly a strange sound attracts his attention. Frank approaches Dreadlock's body and realizes that a disgusting organic sound is coming from his head. Raising Dredd's head, he discovers that his remaining eye is trying to jump out of its socket. After a few seconds, the eye is successfully removed from the socket using tenacious tentacles. Frank jumps back and notices that a dark aura begins to emanate from the eye. The eye pops out onto Dredd's face and begins to carefully look around, analyzing the situation. Frank watches the behavior of the eye with interest, saying that this is something new. Having noticed Frank, the eye is firmly fixed on him, deciding that he will become his new prey. After a split second, the eye takes off and rushes towards Frank, trying to quickly close the distance. Frank tries to swing the eye away with a scalpel, but he deftly dodges all his attacks. The eye wraps its tentacles around Frank's forearm and crawls higher up his arm, preventing him from striking. After waiting a moment, the eye makes a lightning-fast jerk, trying to get into Frank's eyes. Frank manages to grab the eye, squeezing it in his fist and trying to get a better look at his nimble opponent. The eye takes advantage of Frank's slowness and stuns him with its gaze for several seconds. Skillfully slipping out of Frank's grasp, the class rushes straight into the protagonist's face. Frank loses sight in his right eye and tries to come to his senses. He grabs the eye by the protruding tentacles and tries to pull it out with all his strength, but this apparently does not give any results. After a few seconds, the tentacles of the eye completely slip out of Frank's hands and disappear without a trace into the depths of the eye socket. There is a dead silence, and Frank carefully tries to touch his eye with his hand. However, after a second, the eye activates on its own, lifting Frank's eyelids with the help of tentacles. Frank begins to feel the eye piercing his brain with its tentacles, trying to take control of him. Frank begins to slowly see with his second eye, but he suddenly begins to talk to him, saying that the Queen of Spades did not deceive him by saying that Frank has a weak body. The eye tells Frank that it will now control him and will forever remain in his body, causing incredible pain. However, Frank only mockingly asks his eyes whether he will allow him to suffer. Smiling again, the main character tells the eye that the only one who will suffer here is him. The eye says that he controls this body, and if he wants, he can kill Frank's loved ones with his own hands. However, suddenly something greatly surprises the eye, and it begins to tremble in horror. Memories from each of Frank's lives surround his eye and begin to torment him. The eye understands that the soul in the market is nothing more than a prison for any otherworldly entity. Frank tells the eye that he is not impressed with his abilities, adding that he will make him feel real pain and suffering. After a few seconds, the eye loses all its powers and dissolves into oblivion under the influence of Frank's consciousness. The chief regains control of his body and realizes that he is now the bearer of the Eye of Blood. He also feels that he can now infect the consciousness of his opponent, leading to further death if he plays a staring contest with him. In addition to all this, Frank realizes that he can now cause hallucinations in people. The main character asks a rhetorical question about whether this eye really brought dread to the second rank so quickly when it began to develop. Focusing on his internal energy, he realizes that he has revealed his powers only by 5%, suggesting that he spent all his strength on this eye, which eventually captured his consciousness. Frank realizes that he can make the eye even stronger if he absorbs other entities. However, he immediately thinks about how he can absorb them, given that in this situation the eye itself climbed into the womb of his mind since this was his only chance. Frank remembers that the eye said something when it first made its way into his mind and replays his words in his memory. He decides to find out more about who the Queen of Spades is and how she told the creature about him. Frank puts Dread's body into a meat grinder and easily grinds it into fine mince. Looking at the spattering blood, Frank admits that he has no idea what this machine is actually needed for, but he is quite satisfied with the result. He sits down and muses that this candlestick might eventually lead him to the club, so this might be the perfect chance to destroy all the otherworldly creatures. Having rummaged through the things left over from Dread, he notices a business card in his jacket pocket and studies it. Frank admits to himself that he is sorry that he has only now begun to feel the presence of otherworldly creatures on the streets, so it is better to just go to the address of the bar first. After some time, Frank finds himself in a neon-lit quarter of his city at the door of a bar. He enters a well-lit and cozy room, carefully looking around. After a while, he walks to the bar and calmly sits down on a chair. The bartender politely greets the main character and asks him what he wants to order. Frank tells the bartender that he would like to order 24 black rose petals. The bartender apologizes, saying that to his great regret, they don't have this variety now. Frank, without raising his eyes, replies that this is not a variety but a flower. The bartender, without changing his face, examines Frank and asks him to come with him. Entering the elevator on a nondescript button, going with Frank to the secret area of the club. After some time, the door opens in front of him, behind which a long, dark corridor awaits Frank, and they ask him to wait for a call. Frank notes that he seems happy with the situation and heads forward along the dark corridor. At the end of the corridor, 2 tall guards wearing sunglasses are waiting for him. Frank notes to himself that this establishment has much more security than the organization for fighting otherworldly creatures. The security guard stops Frank, politely asking him to show his pass, adding that all this is necessary for security purposes. Frank raises his hands, allowing himself to be searched, mentally noting that not everyone he meets can get here. After the search, he calmly hands them the pass he obtained from Dread's body. The guard lets Frank through, wanting him to have a good time. Having passed further, Frank finds himself in a rather large room in which there are about a dozen people. Frank reflects that there are no more than 100 espers in the entire city, but here there are about 10. A girl approaches Frank asking him what she can do to help him. Frank looks around the girl and calmly tells her that he needs to kill a man. The girl calmly invites him to follow him and leads him to a secluded room where all the details can be discussed. Frank asks the girl how much he can get for the head of the leader of the education club. The girl tells Frank that he seems to be a second-rank esper, adding that he will definitely need the help of one more person, and if he is going to attack the Enlightenment Club, then he needs to take care of the necessary uniforms. Frank doesn't let the girl finish and asks her again about how much you can get for the head of the leader of the education club. The girl calmly replies that for his head, you can get not only coins but also various artifacts. However, if he is only interested in money, then the price will be 5,000 coins. Frank continues to ask questions about the cost per head of various members of the educational group, and each time the girl tells him an increasingly lower price. Frank asks her why they charge such low prices for education club members. The girl politely tells him that he asks too many questions, adding that everything has its price. Frank places a bag full of gold coins received from Brad on the glass table. The main character opens the bag, showing the girl the money, and asks her to tell him everything. The girl carefully lays out the coins and tells him that the low price for one of the club members is due to the fact that his strength affects the perception of the enemy and his combat skills are low. She also adds that he is the cousin of the leader of the Enlightenment Club. Frank is surprised that the chosen target is the brother of the club leader, to which the girl tells him that she can cancel his order if he wishes, warning that the advance payment will not be refunded. Franca says that everything is in order and asks her when he can start and what pitfalls can await him. The girl replies that they cannot tell him the exact time but will definitely contact him within a week, adding that he should download a special application through which he can track the status of the order and also confirm the completion of the order and withdraw the reward from the balance. She also tells Frank that if a new order appears, it will immediately appear in his personal account, after which she apologizes for giving out too much information at once. She hands him the contract and says that in case of failure, he has two options, saying that they can return half the cost of the order to him, or the order will be transferred to a more reliable contractor. Frank touches the documents and feels a supernatural force emanating from them. The girl mentally notes that Frank most likely has critical abilities since he was able to feel the flow of energy from the documents and tells him that this is necessary in order to guarantee the validity of contracts in case the client does not make a deposit on time so that they can find him. Frank smiles and understands that this is necessary so that one cannot be deceived by signing under someone else's name and signs the contract. After this, Frank heads out and the girl sees him off and says goodbye to him, asking him to come see them again. Frank walks several blocks before finally stopping to rest. Looking around, he makes sure that no one is watching him, which means he is safe. Frank mentally reflects on the fact that the education club pays as much as 200 coins for his eyes, and admits that he is terribly interested in how much he can earn for its chapter. The next evening, Frank meets with Marty, who asks him if he is also a member of the organization, to which he gives him an affirmative answer. After some time, there is a discussion in the chairman's office that, as a result of the invasion of entities, complete confusion reigns in the country and in the world in general, and some associations began to cultivate their own espers themselves, while others decided to invite them from other countries. Chairman Jason Todd concludes his speech by saying that Frank should be trained by their organization. Brad, also in the office, tells Frank that since they are now partners, he definitely needs to gain more experience in order to keep up. Chairman Jason Todd asks Brad what he knows from the Ace of Spades and how Edward is feeling. Brad replies that behind this card, there is an incredibly large organization called Poker, the secrecy of which is amazing since nothing is known about its composition and the strength of the espers. He also adds that Edward is recovering, but so far he can't do anything on his own. The chairman orders Brad to learn more about poker and allow Edward to fully recover, adding that the new members of the organization have already begun training and will soon be provided with the entire training schedule. Frank notes that this organization is very strong, and it is still unknown what monsters may live there, adding that it is imperative to find it. After a week of training, Frank notes that they never started fighting the entities and the Black Rose never answered him. However, suddenly a notification appears in his Black Rose account that his order has been completed and requires confirmation. Meanwhile, in an unknown location in a huge tower, a meeting of the Enlightenment Club is taking place. In the center of the round table sits a man in a white tuxedo and blonde hair who is very alarmed by the latest events. He angrily complains that he lost Dread and his candlestick in one day, suggesting that someone is hunting the Enlightenment Club. He breaks a glass of wine and shouts at his subordinates, ordering them to find the source of his problems and get him out of the earth if they have to. A minute later, a tall, slender woman wearing an expensive dress enters the hall and sits on his lap, asking him to calm down. The man drives the girl away, asking her not to come at him with her mouth, which is unclear where it has been. The girl again asks the man to calm down, saying that in a week she will eliminate all his problems. After some time, Edward contacts Brad and Chairman Jason Todd by phone, telling them that he will soon recover, but will not return to duty anytime soon. The chairman says that while Edward is recovering, they will have to find a replacement who will go to explore the hospital grounds. Brad offers to send Frank there since he has already been there and got out, which could work into his hands. The chairman says that this task may be too dangerous, to which Brad asks him what the difference is between the 5th and 4th class danger of the task. The chairman becomes furious, saying that for a 3rd-rank Esper, of course, there will be no difference. He also adds that now, in addition to everything else, there are also gamblers who can attack at any moment. Edward watches Brad and Jason argue and says that because of Brad's luck, everyone will die except him, so he shouldn't care. Brad puts on an important face and says that a real man must go through fire, water, and copper pipes. Edward decides to put the phone aside, and the chairman suggests calling Frank for this task. Sometime after Frank arrives, the chairman tells him that he wants to entrust him with a very important task. Frank says that if this task is not connected with otherworldly entities, then he will not complete it. The chairman tells him that it is related to an incident caused by an entity from Henshan village. Frank takes the document in his hands, admitting that he has never heard of this village. Jason says it's a very small village just outside the city that's almost impossible to get to. He adds that the name of the village came from the color of the water in the nearby river. The chairman says that over the years many residents have drowned in the river, but everyone thought they were accidents. Against the backdrop of a series of such events, a local resident had a dream in which he found himself on the bank of a river. However, this dream turned out to be a waking dream, so he was able to wake up on time. Jason Todd summarizes that the organization has already begun an investigation, and the incident has been codenamed Depth. Frank notices that this incident is classified as a Category 4 threat, and notes that it will be very interesting. The main character remembers that the organization pays 10 coins for Class 5 incidents, 100 for Class 4, 1,000 for Class 3, and so on. He muses that it will be easier for him to earn his place in the Enlightenment Club this way. The chairman says that this is Frank's first case, and since his abilities are still a secret to him, Investigator Catherine will be assigned to him as a partner. Frank is happy that after a week of no contact with the entities, he has a chance to meet them. He recalls that in a week he tried to kill his wife several times, but due to the difference in level between them, he constantly died, rolling back. The chairman mentally notes that there is a very oppressive aura around Frank, adding that he does not at all look like an Esper who has successfully passed the test for loss of sanity. Jason tells Frank that they will have another partner with them, who will be an ordinary person who will help them deal with this case. Jason Todd picks up his office phone and calls a girl named Susie, asking her to come to his office. Frank hears the thoughts of the girl as she hurriedly approaches the chairman's office. A second later, a short girl enters the office and, without calculating her strength, slams the door. A girl named Susie, out of breath from running up the stairs, hurriedly greets the chairman. The chairman introduces Susie to Frank, saying that she will work with him from now on. Jason Todd mentally remembers that Susie is a graduate of a prestigious university, trained in the organization, and she cannot help but know that Espers have all the senses much sharper than an ordinary person. Susie politely introduces herself to Frank, bowing slightly as she begins to recite her registration number. Frank rudely shuts Susie up, telling her to send him her phone number and friend request, adding that she shouldn't even try to call until he accepts her. As he leaves, he tells Susie that she is good at making faces, but she doesn't need to do that anymore. After a while, Frank checks his phone and sees a friend request from Susie, thinking that she looks like the girl with the lollipop I met on the first street. Suddenly, the main character is called out and asked to move his rolls more quickly. He looks around and sees that Marty and investigator Catherine are waiting for him, who tells him that they are already tired of waiting for him. Frank gets into the car, and the unknown man in the car introduces himself, saying his name is Dexter, adding that he can teleport. Marty excitedly tells Dexter that his ability is incredible, after which Dexter asks him what superpower Marty has, to which investigator Catherine says that it is better for him not to know about it. Catherine says that she will quickly introduce everyone, since she is the most senior in rank, saying that she can control flames, and Frank can read minds. She also adds that Marty's ability is enhanced potency, which makes Dexter laugh. However, the investigator cuts him off, saying that he can only teleport 10 centimeters per hour. Marty and Dexter begin to argue passionately, mocking each other, thereby irritating investigator Catherine. After hearing enough men joke about each other, she uses her ability to set Marty and Dexter's faces on fire. He orders them to be quiet, adding that if they continue, they will go to the village on foot. Frank mentally reflects that he and Catherine were given espers who cannot normally confront the entities, and concludes that the organization no longer has anyone to send due to a lack of hands. Sometime later, late in the evening, a group of heroes arrives at their destination, looking over the village from a hill. A few minutes later, Frank notices the will-o'-the-wisp of a flashlight in the darkness and tells his companions that there is someone ahead. In the darkness, under the dim lights, the face of a hunched old man appears slightly, greeting investigator Catherine, asking her name. Catherine tells the old man that he guessed correctly, calling him Prefect Willis. The old man introduces his son, who is walking next to him named Drake, and invites them to follow him. Tens of minutes later, investigator Catherine takes a shower, reflecting on past events and Frank's powers, deciding to be on guard. She gets out of the shower asking if anything strange happened while she was gone. Dexter replies that nothing strange happened, after which Catherine says that everyone needs to go to bed and start working tomorrow, since according to their information, the local river is somehow connected with the entity. Frank says the word hair out loud, drawing the attention of investigator Catherine. The main character notes that the old man has too good hair, despite his very old age. Catherine says Frank is right in noting that such hair care requires not only money, but also time, and this is too expensive for people like him. Catherine suggests that everyone else go to bed, saying that she will remain on duty, after which they will switch. Frank gets up from the table and goes outside without answering Marty's questions about whether he wants to sleep with them. Frank mentally reasons that, in his opinion, the entity will only attack one at a time, leaving the group alone. He also notes that he noticed absolutely no entity in this village. After some time, Frank lies down on the bed in his room and remembers that the only place where he encountered entities was the hospital. He adds that at that time the hospital did not have a single source of communication with the outside world, but here there is definitely one. After a while, Frank falls asleep and something dark envelops him. Suddenly he wakes up feeling a strong, otherworldly aura around him. Rising up on the mattress, he looks around and sees nothing around him except pitch darkness. Frank decides to get his phone and turns on the flashlight to discover that he is in the middle of a black river. Shining a flashlight around, he discovers investigator Catherine sleeping next to him. Catherine wakes up from the light of the flashlight and asks him who is shining, to which Frank tells her that it is him. She asks him what he forgot in her room, to which he asks her to look around and ask again. Looking around, Catherine notices Marty and Dexter sleeping next to each other, saying that a flashlight would not interfere with their sleep. Catherine also turns on the flashlight and looks around, asking Frank what happened. Marty wakes up and asks Frank why he is shining a flashlight at him. Suddenly, Dexter jumps on Marty, screaming in fear that he doesn't like the fact that they are in the middle of the river. Frank says that this is the river where the entity was found, and they are right in the center of it. Marty and Dexter hug in fear when they see the whirlpool and panic and try to think of escape options. Investigator Catherine listens to their stupidest guesses about how to cross the Black River and begins to boil with irritation. Having heard enough, she shouts orders to shut up, saying that no one will jump anywhere. Frank reasons that the entity will not let them go so easily, but wonders why they were transported to the center of the river. Dexter says that despite his attempts to row, there was no movement, as if something was holding them in place. Catherine says that apparently the entity can control the flow of the river, so under no circumstances should you go into the water. She adds that despite her ability to control flames, in the worst-case scenario, she can only save herself. Marty asks Frank what they should do since they ended up in the cauldron and is surprised at what he sees. Frank takes out various tools from his bag and then ties a rope tightly around the shovel. Rising to his full height, he begins to forcefully spin it on the rope, cutting through the air with a whistle. Taking good aim, he throws the shovel, catching on a black tree sticking out of the water. Having pulled the rope, he looks at his companions and in a confident voice tells them to hold on to him.